All right, welcome everyone to this live stream. Just checking it's all set up properly. And it is, and it seems like I'm robotic as normal or as usual. Again, I don't know why that is, but usually it disappears. So, um, first thing I'm going to say um, well, thanks for joining. And the second thing I'm going to say is that I I mean we finished the conference finished um on Sunday, well, Sunday night, like quite late for me. And then Monday morning I woke up ill. So I've been ill for the past few days. Um and I'm still fighting off the remnants of it, but I you know, am like fine enough to like, watch stuff, understand stuff, talk, all this, obviously, that sort of stuff. Um, and I came across this. I mean, I'm a bit late, it's 3 months old. Um, but there was this debate, the antinatalist debate that I saw had happened on a debate channel. And I thought, oh, it'd be interesting to watch that. And I thought, actually, it'd be interesting to watch it on a live stream. So that's what we're going to do in this one. But it's going to be a very laid back one. This is not going to be like a full on stream. It's going to be more laid back. I'll just be watching the debate, commenting on things as and when I see stuff that I want to, or hear stuff that I want to comment on. Um, and that's basically it, really. I'm not going to be, on the top of my game or anything like that, for obvious reasons. But yeah, if no one said hey in the chat yet, but if anyone watching who wants to say hi in the chat. Be good to hear from you. But yeah, I'll just be listening. It's gonna be very relaxed. I've even got some food here, and yeah. So basically, there are these sort of debate channels on YouTube that act as platforms or mediators for debate. So two different people, whoever they are. They can be nobodies or they can be known streamers or video makers or whatever. Um, they will go on these platforms to do debates. So there's ones called like the Crucible, Modern Day Debates, and then there's this one called Everyday Debate, which I mean is very very small. They've only got like 51 subscribers, and this video has got 544 views, and this is the most viewed video on their channel. So, but it popped up in my recommended videos, and I saw an antinatalist debate on a debate channel, so I thought it'd be interesting to watch. So we're gonna watch it. It's 2 hours 20 minutes, but we're gonna watch it on 1.5. So I don't know what that will reduce it down to. But yeah, I just thought we could watch it. You chuck in your thoughts in the chat whenever you feel like it. I'll chuck in my thoughts whenever I feel like it. Watching. Um, but yeah, other than that, that's the basic setup of the stream, really. So let's bring it on to the video. So I'm actually going to bring it down a bit so that you. You know what might actually be better is if I change. I think it's too much to do at the moment. Let's just keep it like this. So you've got this guy Blate, who is antinatalist. I'm not sure I'm not sure I know this guy. I don't think I've ever interacted with him. I'm not really sure who he is. Duke is the moderator, and this guy Percy is the pro-natalist or arguing against the antinatalist position. And yeah, basically, they're going to have a debate. So to be honest, I don't think there's really anything else to get into. So let's just go for it.
Debate is a debate on antinatalism, the philosophical position against reproduction. Specifically, our debate topic is it's morally wrong to reproduce. We have Blate on the pro, who believes it is morally wrong to reproduce, and we have Percy on the con, who believes it is not morally wrong to reproduce. We'll start with opening statements as always. We're going to allow them to be a little bit longer today per the debater's request, and then we'll get at it. So Blate, you are up with 6 minutes on the clock.
All right. I am here today to inform you that you were all a mistake. You never should have existed, and I am truly sorry that you find yourself in this circumstance. As Nietzsche, Buddha, and many others have noted, to live is to suffer. This statement is not just some edgy poetry, it is deeply true. And there's a very good reason that it is true. And that reason is evolution by natural selection. If you look at nature from a broad perspective, like a forest in a valley, you may find it serene and beautiful. But if you zoom in, you see the truth. A horror show of organisms eating other organisms, skittish prey animals in constant fear of the slightest rustling of leaves, or being ripped limb from limb by a predator. And the predators, hungrily hunting for their prey until they overhunt and many starve to death until the prey species replenishes and the cycle repeats. This is the process that shaped us. And in the beginning, when organisms were relatively simple and mechanistic, all was well. But as the evolutionary arms race continued, eventually a new and powerful weapon emerged: the mind. Minds are extremely useful for survival. They allow the organisms to process information from its surrounding and makes decisions about the best path forward. However, the invention of the mind, with the invention of the mind, old Mother Evolution encountered a problem. One very annoying tag-along that comes with the mind is the will. And wills are quite the problem indeed, for you see, wills can choose to do things that are not optimal for the survival of the organism and the spreading of genes. Mother Evolution could not have this, of course, so she devised a method to control the will and bring it in line. It is an elegant, but as it turns out, truly insidious solution: the carrot and the stick, pleasure and suffering. For you see, unfortunately for us, the most efficient way to implement this system to achieve the highest survivability is not to maximize pleasure. Oh no, as it turns out, the most efficient method is to turn us all into crackheads, drug addicts, drip feeding us just enough of that sweet, sweet pleasure to keep us addicted and searching for more, but never too much or for too long. Oh no, if it lets us experience pleasure for too long, then we would just sit beneath the shade tree, basking in the afterglow of our pleasure, and become sedentary. That won't do it all. Mother Evolution needs us back out on the savannah, hunting and gathering and doing all those things that aid in our survival. Always chasing that next fix, that next hit of delicious pleasure. You've all experienced this in your own lives. You eat food for good taste that lasts moments and fullness that fades quickly. You train for hours and months at some sport just for a few short moments of elation if you manage to pull out a win. You work long and hard to achieve some long-term goal that you've set your sights on, and when you finally crest that peak, you have a deep sense of accomplishment, fulfillment, and contentment. But it fades quickly. You stare out at the view from atop the mountain, nod to yourself, and then it's back down into the valley of pain and toil, on to climb the next hill to chase the next fix of pleasure. But Mother Evolution need not be so conservative when it comes to doling out pain and suffering. There's no risk of complacency there. The more suffering she shovels upon us, the more motivated we are to escape it, to return to another brief indulgence of pleasure. So here we find ourselves, in this Hobbesian nightmare, slaves to the capricious masters that are our genes. This is the imbalance that drives the argument for antinatalism. Because of this twisted reward system that evolution has devised, a little bit of carrot to keep us motivated, and a whole lot of stick to keep us moving. This all but guarantees that any life will be filled with far more suffering than pleasure. A win for the genes in their simple quest to multiply, but a net negative for the minds they created and enslaved to do their bidding. Now, I am not here to advocate for suicide or murder. There are various reasons why an already existing being may have a vested interest.
This his sort of introduction, it sounds much more sort of like ethicalisty than antinatalisty, in terms of its it's like its rhetoric. And I also think some people may, like when you're doing an actual debate, well, it does really depend, because there are two ways you can sort of present your arguments. One, you can sort of narrativize them, which is what he's doing there, or you can just like present them quite sort of like bluntly. And there are merits to both. I think I think when it comes to this topic, I seem to think that just presenting them like bluntly is better, but I could be wrong, to be honest, because he sort of weaved this whole story together instead of just saying, "This is my argument. This is my next one. This is my next one," which, I mean, we'll see how it goes, but I don't think I would have used my opening statement in the same way, but I can see why he did.
And continuing to exist despite this state of affairs. But it is immoral to choose to bring a new being into this nightmare without their consent. And since we cannot interrogate the desires of the unborn, we have no choice but to decide for them. and we should make for them the most rational choice. Summarize, my friends, we are all Sisyphus, doomed to push that rock up the hill for the rest of our lives. If you find a way to cope with this and choose to continue pushing that rock up the hill, that's great. I applaud you. However, if, knowing all of this, you choose to place a new child at the bottom of that hill, just to point to that boulder and say, kid, get to pushing until you die, then you are a moral monster. Over to you, Percy.
Oh, I just realized I was muted. Okay, thank you for that opening statement. I guess I'll get into my points. So I don't actually have a written opening statement. I'm just going to attempt a free response to some of the considerations that you raised. So I believe you've raised what would be characterized as the quality of life argument for antinatalism and the argument from consent. These are two of the philanthropic arguments for antinatalism, which are arguments that depend on that raise concerns about the person who is created as the basis for thinking that it's wrong to reproduce. That's as opposed to the misanthropic arguments, which say that it's wrong to reproduce because of the effects that the created people will have on other beings. So I think there's going to be two.
Well, at least it sounds like this guy's done some research.
Basic strategies that I'm going to pursue here. One is to try to show that there are very unfortunate implications of your view if those arguments succeed. And then the second is to try to show that there's a good alternative. Okay, so first thing I'll say, I think that if the quality of life argument is correct and our lives are abysmal and not worth living, then we don't have a duty to save a drowning child in a pond. Why do I think that? Well, the reasoning is basically you don't have an obligation to give someone a drug that you know it would be irrational for them to take and that would leave them worse off if taken. So it's plausible enough that you have a duty to save someone if you can actually give them something that will make them better off. But if the quality of life objection to pronatalism is true, then it's a bit like throwing the child a life raft that's covered in a liquid that will give them locked-in syndrome plus major depressive disorder plus akathisia, so it feels like they're being kicked in the balls every 3 seconds, right? If you had that kind of life raft, you wouldn't have an obligation to.
I think this guy is maybe confusing the quality of life argument a bit, because the quality of life argument, it's not saying that your life is extremely shit and it's extremely shit now, and if you're in a situation where you may die and I prevent that, then then I'm just like completely dropping you in the shit. Sorry, I'm gonna sneeze. Oh, maybe I'm not. The quality of life argument is basically just saying that our lives are much worse than we tend to think on average. They contain a lot of bad, a lot of harm, and so it's better, or it's a serious harm to bring someone into existence. Now, once someone's here, we have a very strong desire to continue to exist, and there are many other things that we want to pursue in life, right? So we as at just a base level, we have the interest in continuing to exist, but there are many other things that we establish and work on and pursue once we're alive that we want to continue doing so, right? Relationships we want to maintain, all of this sort of stuff. And so to let someone die if they're in a situation where their life is at risk, and he used the example of like someone in a drowning pond, etc. I think he's sort of talking about Peter Singer's thought experiment there. So you can sort of trivially sort of save their life, then I think then if you don't do that, you are sort of you're I'm getting my words muddled. You are not helping them continue to exist so that they can realize these interests, right? So the quality of life argument is about there are serious harms in life, and if you create someone, you expose them to those harms. You can't really translate it to, and that's starting a life, you can't really translate it in the same way to continuing a life, because once someone is alive, whilst we can recognize there are all those harms are unequally distributed throughout their life, but also you you have all these established interests now, which isn't the case when you're bringing someone into existence. So I think his translation of the quality of life argument from considering someone who will come into existence to considering someone who will continue to exist doesn't really work. You know, it could work if your quality of life was bad enough. So, for example, when for a lot of people, the badness in their life, it's skewed towards the end, right? And so, if you if you're in this if you are in this situation that he presents, and you know, if you were to help them, you'd just be putting them in a whole load of other shit. Well, that could be the case if they're like very old, or like, you know, dying of cancer, they're about to die, you know, and they're suffering, and then you help them, you know, prolong their life a bit more. Then yeah, you would be doing what he's saying. You would be saving them, but like out of the frying pan and into the fire, if you get what I mean. So it's very context dependent when someone already exists, but when you're thinking about bringing someone into existence, you don't really have to think about it in the same way in terms of the distribution and the context you're putting them into, because when you're considering bringing someone into existence, you just need to consider the totality of the harm that you're going to expose them to. There is some consideration you do need to give to the sort of distribution of that harm, because if it's very bunched up in one place, you know, that could constitute extreme suffering, as opposed to bringing someone into existence who has the same, you know, total amount of harm, but it's evenly spread throughout their life. So it's sort of like a low level sort of maybe discomfort in some way. But who am I to say? Like, I don't know which of those would be worse, like a brief extreme harm to an elongated, you know, lesser harm. I'm not sure which one would be worse, to be honest. But anyway, the basic point that I'm trying to make is that he's trying to superimpose the quality of life argument onto all cases of continuing to exist, which it doesn't really work. But anyway, like, my brain's a bit jumbled, so let's just continue.
To give it to the child. And why? Well, it's because you're not in a position to actually save the child in a meaningful sense. Okay. So then the second objection I'm going to raise is, I actually think that your argument lends some plausibility to the idea that we should pursue a campaign of mass sterilization, involuntary coercive sterilization, especially of Orthodox Jews. Okay. And why do I say that? Well, the reasoning would be, it sounds like you're saying that it's not just a minor peccadillo if you reproduce. You're saying it's a severe, very grave violation of rights. And here's a plausible principle. You don't have a moral right to something which could only be used in order to violate other people's rights, right? So I don't have a right to a nuclear bomb, to a suitcase nuke. And if I had, let's say, like a device implanted into my skin that would emit an odor that would kill everyone who surrounds me, I wouldn't be able to plead my bodily autonomy in order for you to not forcibly remove the device. Okay, but that's what our reproductive anatomy is, on your view, because all an Orthodox Jew is going to do with their reproductive functions is to violate people's rights. They don't have a right to something that they're going to use to violate people's rights, or that could only be used to violate people's rights. And now, why do I specifically single out Orthodox Jews? Well, because
it's like emotionally appealing to people, probably.
One person reproduces, they initiate a chain of reproductive events, right? So it's not just one. So within about 5 generations, within a couple generations, you're going to have tens of thousands of children for any one person who has 5 children today, right? Because Orthodox Jews have a very high rate of fertility.
Well, I mean, he's kind of just asserting the fact that if you view coming into existence as a harm, you therefore must be in favor of, I don't know, like forced sterilization or forced abortion, or, you know, just like restraining people physically from, you know, procreating, which just isn't the case, right? Like, you can view it as a harm, but you can also say that you think the rights implications and the political implications, and the implications for people's general freedom, if you were to enforce this by law, would just be so bad and lead to such an authoritarian society that it would be better not to do that, right? Instead, what you can do is try and change the incentive structure in society so that people reproduce less, try and make the quality of people's lives better, the standard of living better, so that the harm of coming into existence is lessened. Try and convince people to voluntarily not reproduce, all of these sorts of things. You don't just have to jump straight to, therefore you must be in favor of, you know, I don't know what he's suggesting, like forced sterilization or something like that. It's the same as like someone can be pro-life but not think that the government should have the ability to force someone to continue a pregnancy or something like that. You know, some people hold that view. I was going to give another example, but it's completely gone from my mind. But yeah, it's like you can view something as a harm, but also recognize that, one, it would just be impractical to want to impose it by force, and also you can realize that imposing it by force would step over so many other ethical lines that it wouldn't be worth doing that.
And when they reproduce, their children are foreseeably going to
This guy really likes going for worst
also
case
reproduce.
scenarios.
And so
Really likes going for worst case scenarios, doesn't he? He's got a thing for those.
their kids have kids, their kids will have kids, and their kids will have kids. And the law of exponential growth says that within a few generations, you get like 10,000 descendants. Okay, so the principle is basically this: if you think that reproduction is a severe injustice against the person who is created, and if you know that by killing someone or sterilizing someone, you can prevent 10,000 severe rights violations and severe injustices, then you have a moral permission to kill that person and prevent those injustices. Okay. All right. So then the next point is going to be pregnant mothers have a duty to have abortions, on your view. Okay, so before, and so I bring this up just because I assume it goes needless to say, if you're an antinatalist, you're not a traditional religious conservative. You're probably someone who's more cut from the cloth of the left wing politically. And so you probably would consider it an unpalatable implication of your view if it implied that you that we shouldn't be pro-choice on abortion. We should actually be actively anti-choice on abortion, namely because mothers have a duty to terminate their pregnancies. And so why is that? Well, the reason is just because all a mother is doing by gestating to term is violating someone's rights, and you don't have a right to violate someone's rights, and so you can be stopped by force if necessary. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So then the next thing I'm going to say is I think your argument has the implication that you should not respect people. The reason for this is because in order to respect someone, you have to believe that they're better than nothing. But antinatalism implies that no one is better than nothing. It'd be better.
Oh my fucking god, this that is the worst take I have come across, I think. So no one is deserving of respect. Also, hi Runa in the chat as well, welcome. Also, hey Rainer Gaming. So this guy is completely confused this. So antinatalists aren't saying that people are worth less than nothing. What they're saying is that existence has no advantage over non-existence, and coming into existence is a harm, right? So if you were to take from that someone who has come into existence is not worth respecting, that's victim blaming. Does he not get what? So, like, antinatalists view people who come into existence, which obviously by definition is everyone, as the victims of that. Why would we then say that they're not worthy of respect? Like, oh my god. Like the only group of people that you could see why an antinatalist, and I don't hold this view, and I actually disagree with it, but I can see why they would hold this view. I think it's misguided, but I can see why. The only group of people that that it would even remotely make sense, even though I still don't think it makes sense for antinatalists to have no respect for, is people who choose to biologically reproduce themselves and continue the cycle, right? Now I don't think that is, I do think they are, what, deserving of respect. Well, obviously, not everyone, depends on the person. Some people just do horribly atrocious stuff, but just the fact that they have reproduced obviously doesn't mean they're not deserving of respect at all. That's not my view. I know some antinatalists take it, in my opinion, too far and don't respect them, but you can at least see how it's linked to the philosophy there, even though I don't think it does follow. But but to say that you don't respect anyone because they've come into existence, let's just rewatch this, because maybe I'm misunderstanding, because I can't believe this guy has got it that wrong.
To terminate their pregnancies. So why is that? Well, the reason is just because all a mother is doing by gestating to term is violating someone's rights, and you don't have a right to violate someone's rights, and so you can be stopped by force if necessary. Okay. So then the next thing I'm going to say is, I think your argument has the implication that you should not respect people. The reason for this is because in order to respect someone, you have to believe that they're better than nothing. But antinatalism implies that no one is better than nothing. It'd be better if we weren't here.
Oh my Christ, that's so funny. I've honestly, I've never come across anyone who's made this mistake before. That is hilarious.
Right. Okay. Finally, the position my opponents expressed implies that you shouldn't resurrect a little girl who dies in a car accident along with her family if they're the only affected parties. Okay, why is that? Well, there's no one there to suffer the harm.
Yeah, if someone has died, so if someone, like he's saying, they, like, for whatever reason, they've died, completely brain dead. Morally speaking, like, there is no one there. Like, just at that point, they are essentially just a clump of matter. Like, there's nothing going on. There is no one home. Like, they are dead, right? Then if you were to somehow magically, like, how does he think these people can be resurrected? Like, are we talking like Frankenstein level stuff? Or like, what does he mean? Or maybe he just means like CPR or something like that. But I'm not sure what the I'm not actually sure what the science is when it comes to CPR, in terms of, like, if you can resuscitate someone, are they in some way still alive at that point? But once the brain is gone, they're gone. I don't know what the science is there. So the CPR case may be a grey area. But let's just say they're like dead. So there would be no difference in terms of their sentience as to now or 10 years from now. Like, obviously, in that 10 years, their body would have degraded and stuff. But in terms of their, sentience and their moral relevance, that wouldn't have changed. It would have just held constant that whole time. So, yeah, if someone was to come up to an antinatalist and say, should we, for all intents and purposes, say, create a new individual, right, by reviving, well, not even reviving, but like reanimating that person, reanimating that corpse, would antinatalists say no? I think they would say no. Yeah, like, as far as I can tell from the sort of thing he's laid out there, yeah, for all intents and purposes, you would be creating a new individual. It would be like Frankenstein resurrecting, well, not even resurrecting, but Frankenstein creating his monster, right? Yeah, obviously an antinatalist is going to be against that. That the scenario he's constructed around it engages with people's emotions, but the actual nuts and bolts of the ethics of the situation are exactly the same as having a kid, right? So it seems like the antinatalist take is going to be the same either way. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe he's talking about the CPR, case of CPR, and then it probably is more complicated because, they could still be alive to some degree, and therefore you're not like recreating them. I don't know the biology of death, so would it be like them waking up from like a very deep sleep, but they just wouldn't wake up naturally? You would have to wake them up or something like that. I'm not sure, but in the case of like if they're dead, yeah, then it would be like creating another person. But it's an interesting one he said there, but like interesting thought experiment he's put there. Like I don't know all of the answers to 100% certainty, but it's an interesting one.
On his view, I'm sort of assuming here you have kind of an Epicurean intuition about the badness of death, because most antinatalists, in my experience, do. If you don't go for that,
oh, that's not my understanding. So for anyone that doesn't know, Epicurean view of death is basically that death itself isn't a harm. But yeah, that's not my experience of antinatalists. Some of them have that, some of them don't. It's pretty mixed from my experience.
That's fine, but then I think that's going to open up some difficulties for your view later. Okay, so those are some
Aussie investors in the chat. Hey, Aussie investor. No, in the case he put, he said that their deaths would only impact them. So you're sort of cancelling out any other considerations of like people who would be sad that they would have would have died, but also it's not entirely that's not entirely different in when you create someone. I'm not saying it's the same, because I don't think it's the same, but if you fail to bring someone into existence, that also can have knock-on consequences for others. A lot of people, if they're involuntarily childless, that sometimes it can ruin people's lives. So yeah,
the unpalatable implications of my opponent's view. Now I'm going to attempt to address it that's me playing offense, but maybe I'll say some things in defense of my view. How much time do I have, Duke, or should we just go into the back and forth?
Yeah. Let's go into back and forth, and that defense can crop up as you guys are talking about it.
Okay, Blake, why don't I offer you some remarks in my defense, and then you can sort of cross-examine what I'm saying.
All right.
Okay, so I'm just going to address the argument from consent. So if I have your view correctly understood, it sounds like what you're saying is that if it's expected, so the first premise is an empirical premise, which is that the expected value of any created being is negative. So that's one of the premises, correct?
Right.
Oh, see, I wouldn't say that is the case. So I think Blake here has just completely unnecessarily added an additional thing that he's now got to demonstrate, which I really don't think he needed to do. Like you could just say, and it's pretty uncontroversial to say that life contains a significant amount of harm for most people. Or, I'm pretty sure it would be uncontroversial to say for all people, to be honest. But that's it. You take it one step further and you add more. You add another thing you've got to prove or demonstrate when you say that the amount of harm outweighs the pleasure or benefits, or however you want to put it. Which you can also do, but it's harder to do that, and I don't think it's necessary, so I don't know why you would. But he seems to have agreed with that, so we'll see how he deals with it.
All right, okay. So then the next premise seems to be if in expectation creating someone is going to result in a life not worth living, then you would only have permission to do that if the person consented to it, and people can't provide that consent.
I think he's made another slip up, because he's just conceded that there are lives worth living and lives worth not living. And there you could have said, well, I don't think any lives are worth starting, right? There's lives worth continuing and lives worth not continuing, but there's no lives worth starting. so just straight off the bat, there are two things that are wrong with this guy's argument he's going to make, which Blake could have pulled him up on, but he hasn't.
Right. Okay. So then the last premise is people can't provide that consent because there's no one available to ask because no one exists yet. Right.
Yep.
So that's the argument. Okay. Yeah. I'm going to start by just challenging the empirical claim. Okay. So there is an academic literature that studies the happiness of people's lives. It's called positive psychology. One of the very famous representatives of this field is at Stanford. Her name is Sonia Lyubomirsky, and she popularized in her book, The How of Happiness, a lot of this research. And one of the punchlines of that research is that most people are happy according to their self-ratings. Okay, so if you look at the website ourworldinData.org, they have some visualizations of this data, but the idea is basically social scientists will go and they will ask people questions like, how happy were you yesterday? And then, there will be some idiosyncratic differences based on random variation there in terms of whether someone had a bad day yesterday, but that's expected to average out across millions and millions and millions of observations. And so if you ask enough people that question, you can kind of get a sense of how happy are people on any given day. All right, so they've done this, and they've been doing it every year since about the 1970s in most countries, especially in Western countries, but there is actually data on developing countries. And what you find is the surprising hedonic adaptation effect, which is what psychologists term this fact that despite a wide range of variation in people's life circumstances, people tend to find their lives about between a 7 and a 9 out of 10 in terms of their assessment of the best possible life to the worst possible life, ratings from 1 to 10, right? Okay, so it's very hard to find people who say things like, oh my God, my life is a 3 out of 10 or a 2 out of 10. Overwhelmingly, people are concentrated with surprisingly low variance at the 8 out of 10, 7 out of 10 figure. Okay, so what exactly, so one of the points that you made, I think, was sort of like an argument from evolutionary psychology. The idea was that there's
should we stick with that
okay,
first?
yeah. Why don't we do that? Yeah, go.
Yeah, okay. So on that point, what you're talking about is mostly a result of Pollyannism, which is the tendency of people to remember more the positive experiences in their life than the negative experiences, and they remember them more accurately than the negative experiences. And that's evidenced by the number you just stated. Most people rate their lives at an 8 out of 10, which is just obviously not true. If they were accurate, most people should be rating their lives about a 5 out of 10. So there's all sorts of research by psychologists that prove this out in multiple ways. There's all sorts of positivity biases that humans have, and this makes sense from an evolutionary perspective too, because if anyone actually got far enough down the evolutionary line of believing their lives in retrospect to be terrible and expecting them to be terrible in the future, they wouldn't have kids as much as the people that were deluding themselves into thinking otherwise.
Okay, so sorry. So one objection that I'd like you to entertain is just going to be kind of a request for further evidence. Okay, so you might think that the good of a person's life is actually constituted by their subjective assessments, and if that's plausible to you, which it is to me, then the question has to be, okay, well then what is this alternative metric that you propose that gives us a better sense of how happy people are, that's independent of what the people themselves say? Whatever that is, you need to tell us what it is, and then you also need to show that it leads to this conclusion that people are veritably living lives that aren't worth living.
Sure, it would just be the actual pleasure or the prevalence of pleasure and suffering. Because under the view that you just gave, we could have someone in a cult who's just being abused every day. But if we brainwash them sufficiently and ask them how well their life's going, if they say it's going pretty well, then we have to assume that this cult is totally fine, and we should just leave it as is.
Yeah, okay, so I'm happy to say that there is some kind of objective list element to what makes life good. It's not just our subjective impression. But
no, it doesn't matter. I was going to say something, but I would just get onto a whole other thing.
It'd be just a subjective impression, but we can be wrong in retrospect about how well that went.
Yeah, no, I understand that. I guess one question, but like, is that actually what's happening for the average person? And I would question that. I mean, it seems like if you were giving evolutionary psychology reasons to argue sort of.
I just feel like all of this is kind of like it's tangential. Like you get into this whole debate about empirics that you really don't need to, because it's like, even if this guy, even if this, Percy, even if he like sort of comes out on top on this part and shows, most people judge their lives to be decent, so we can trust that, and let's say most people's lives are decent, like that just isn't an argument for creating new people. So like even if Percy comes out on top, he doesn't get what he wants. So it just seems like a bit of a distraction, right? To go down this path in the first place. It's like, well, the majority of just because people enjoy something that is associated with harm doesn't mean that we can go around imposing it on others, right? Like if, you know, the vast majority of drug addicts, whilst they're on the drugs that they use, they will say, yeah, this is great, I feel great, I am enjoying this, you know, while the effects are lasting. Does that mean we should go around and get more people hooked up on drugs? No. People would not say that.
A priori, that you would expect our lives to be bad. But I don't see why you couldn't read the evidence the other way and say maybe actually evolution would get the job done the best in terms of securing our reproductive viability by just giving us the ability to thrive in our environments psychologically and physically. And so it is good. Like, you would expect evolution to set us up so that we would tend to have lots of happy experiences. And so what's wrong with that?
That's interesting. I've never heard anyone take that tact.
Well, no, I think you'd expect evolution to build into us a wanting for more, right? We'd constantly be wanting to seek out more status, more resources, because this will help us survive. If evolution set us up to be happy and content, then we wouldn't want to go out and like secure things that will help us like survive. And presumably if we were like, if evolution had built, you know, this optimization for happiness, would it necessarily lead to higher reproduction? Because if we'd be so content in our current situation, why would we want to drastically change the situation by creating a child, and all the associated risks with that, right? Like, childbirth was much more risky back then. Like, a child was a lot harder to raise, you know, to a healthy age, because we didn't have medicine and stuff like that. Like, if we were optimized for happiness and we were super like happy, you know, in our environment, why would we, like, it doesn't seem like there's a clear path from that to therefore we would want to reproduce more, right? Which is what evolution is optimizing for us to reproduce as much as possible. It seems like that would be more aligned with optimizing for us to want, right? Which also seems to play out in modern culture. Like, we get hoodwinked all the time by wanting more, and companies playing on that desire for us always to constantly want more, right? And we have to actively work against that. So yeah, I'm not sure his assumptions there are totally legit.
It seems to be pretty widely accepted that, in large part based, well, at least based and reflect on the evolutionary aspect there, that most of your life is either tedium or working towards some goal. Just even for like the little stuff, every day you spend probably at least like a couple hours hungry before you decide to eat, and then the satisfaction from eating lasts like a few minutes, and the fullness, the actual feeling of fullness, just a few minutes, and then you're kind of just back to a neutral state and you're on to pursuing other goals, trying to alleviate other concerns that you have. And it's like the constant struggle. Most of your life is trying to obtain something, with just a few short moments of satisfaction having obtained that thing at the crest of each of those peaks, or each of those valleys.
Right, okay. Well, you know, it's funny that you go for the objective list theory, because many people see that as actually a theory that says that even if our lives contain suffering, the objective elements outweigh the suffering. So they say there's a lot of suffering that, for the sake of which there's a lot of suffering it's worth enduring for the sake of the other
Hey, Nadia.
hedonic goods in life, like your relationships or your accomplishments, or the sense of meaning and purpose that, like, say, having children gives you, among other things, or your participation in a religious community. So do you really maintain that those things are not good for people, or do you just say they're not as good as people think they are?
Yeah, so I think that's just cope. It's cope in the sense that
Okay.
we all kind of like have this belief that, like, oh yeah, like these bad things make the good worth it. Maybe they make it that much better. But that's just because that is all we have on offer. That's the only way we can do it. So if we don't find that appealing, then we just die. So an example of this is, like I said earlier, like maybe every day you spend like a couple hours hungry, and then you finally eat. And many people will say, and I would agree, that the experience of being hungry actually makes eating more pleasurable when you finally do it. Like, it's more enjoyable to eat if you're a little hungry than if you're not hungry and decide to start snacking. So an example of this is, imagine, so we have to like spend maybe 2 hours a day hungry to get that bonus satisfaction meeting. Imagine there was another species, another group of people that, in order to get the same benefit from like the additional pleasure of eating by being hungry, they have to be hungry for 3 days, where we only have to be hungry for 2 hours to get the same benefit. I think most people would agree, just objectively, we can look at them and say, yeah, those people are in a worse position than us. That sucks. They have to go through way more suffering, pain, discomfort to get the same amount of pleasure that we do. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, so I'm not going to disagree with you that in theory, like people could be deluded about the good of their lives. I just don't think it registers with the actual world.
Well,
Like I don't think it's true that, but like I don't think the I mean when you say so, what I did was I produced like social science evidence, social scientific evidence that people tend to say that yesterday was a good day on for most people. Okay, so and then your response was just to like stare back incredulously and say, well, we know that certainly just couldn't be true because look at all the hunger that people feel and that sort of thing. I don't understand why that's persuasive. Why should we trust your...
Is that scientific evidence? Like, this is a genuine question. Asking someone, how was your day yesterday, and them telling you, is that scientific evidence? Like, sure, it would be evidence that that is what they think at that point of time about the day prior to when you're asking them. But like everyone knows humans are prone to all sorts of biases, right? So it doesn't seem like the strongest evidence, but I don't know. Well, let's see what Blake says.
Or a sense of incredulity over the mass collective self-report of billions of people across the world.
Well, one, because Pollyannism is a well-studied phenomenon in psychology. I didn't expect this to be a point of contention, so I'm sorry I did not bring specific stats on this, but I promise if you look, you can find them. But there are studies done that have specifically shown, like, where they've done studies and they've like followed people and asked them, like, how happy are you now? How happy are you now? How happy are you now? And they'll answer one way. And at the end, if you go like at the end of it and have them look back, like maybe a month or two later and say, how was it? They will say mysteriously that it was way better than what they reported at the time. So people, it's a well-studied phenomenon that people do have these biases to tend to like view their life more favorably in retrospect than it actually was.
Yeah, so I'm not denying that there is such a thing as a Pollyanna effect. What I'm questioning is whether the effect size is great enough that it outweighs all of the other things that are good in people's lives. Like, so I'm kind of curious what the effect size is. My sense is that this maybe calls on your discretion and judgment, and not everyone's going to agree. But my sense is that most people think that yesterday was happy just based on the evidence that I've seen. And that goes at least toward the hedonic question, and you could fiddle with that and say, well, they're exaggerating just how happy they were. But then I guess there's also the considerations that you seem to be alluding to earlier, which is the other aspects of life that are not matters of pleasure and pain, which can make our lives go well for us or poorly for us, like our relationships and our accomplishments and our sense of meaning and purpose. When people say those things are good for them and that they enrich them deeply and they justify the low points, why do you consider yourself a better judge than them as to what is good for them?
It's not that. It depends on which metric you're going by. Like if they're claiming that it brings them more pleasure in the moment, I'm just doubtful. Now, if
I feel like at this point, they just need to talk about the axiological asymmetry, right? It seems like all of this is just kind of like a tangent. And hey Billy, hey Christian, hey Antcraft. Yeah, sorry about that, Christian. Christian's just saying how speedy talk is because it's like over 2 hours, this debate. So I want to get through it a bit quicker than that. But if it's too quick for you, then you can put your on what you're watching, you can put it down to 0.5 or 0.5 to slow it down. It would mean that I would talk even slower though, but yeah.
Actually believe that, like if there are, like if you could find people that reliably they actually do have a better life, like have more positive experiences than negative experiences, you could say that that is a life worth continuing. But the question is giving the many risks that we know, and all the risks that I mentioned earlier about the tedium and suffering of life that leads to these short stints of pleasure, that's just for like your average person who doesn't have any major problems like cancer or long bouts of depression, which like a fourth of people will experience sometime in their life, and more if you could, like if you include all the other possible ailments that could affect someone. So the question you also have to take into account not only what are the chances of someone actually having a net positive life with net positive experiences, and that's just if they have no other issues, but also what are the chances of them not having any type of these extraordinary issues that are very many in common. And
so that's the risk argument he's putting there. I'm not sure he's really put it across formally as a distinct argument, but yeah, that's what he's expressing.
At the end of life, almost everyone is guaranteed, if you make it that long, to have a lot of discomfort towards the end of life. With all of that in mind, is it still a good idea to roll the dice on bringing someone into existence when, if you don't bring them into existence, all of the positives you talked about, there is no one there, no one exists to regret the lack of those pleasures, to be deprived of those. No one is being deprived of all the pleasures you mentioned if you don't bring them into existence in the first place. So there's no harm being done there. And that actually gets to the axiological asymmetry, which maybe we should talk about next.
Yeah, why don't you present the asymmetry?
Sure.
Yeah, I feel like now we're getting into things because now we're actually going to get to the sort of meat of the substance rather than the whole sort of quality of life stuff.
Okay, so the axiological asymmetry for everyone else is axiology is the study of value. So it's saying that there is a asymmetry in value between good and bad. So basically, the presence of pain is bad. Everybody agrees there. The presence of pleasure is good. Everyone agrees there. And those two are symmetrical. You got pain being bad and pleasure being good. If you go to the other side, the absence of pain in a non-existent being is good. Most people will just intuitively agree that this is the case, even if that being will never experience that good. The absence of pleasure, on the other hand, in a non-existent being is not bad because there's no one there to be deprived of it. And to like lay this out, where simply, if you consider any empty corner of the universe, or just say like Mars, for example, and we ask the question, is it bad that there's not just like a bunch of happy people living there or any other random rock in the universe right now? Most people don't think like there's something regrettable about that. There's no like moral injustice happening because there's not happy people living in any random empty corner of the universe. But if I ask the reverse question, say, is it a good thing that there's not a bunch of people being tortured on Mars right now? Most people will say, yes, that is a good thing. It is good that there's not people being tortured. So that is the imbalance. And basically what that leads us to is the idea that if we don't bring someone into existence, there is no one there to be deprived of any goods that that person might experience. So there is no regret that they are being deprived of this. But it is still a good thing. Most people would agree that we are not inflicting pains upon this potential person. So like it's many people agree that like if you know you're going to have a child that is going to have some genetic deformity where they're just going to be in agonizing pain for 3 months and then die. If you can prevent that, it's probably best to do so.
Okay, so the basic asymmetry that as I understand it, is kind of like the presence of pain is bad. The presence of pleasure is good. The absence of pleasure is not bad unless there's someone for whom that absence is a deprivation. And then the absence of pain is an active good, even though there's no one available to benefit from that. So the idea basically is that the goods that a prospective life would have don't count in favor of creating it, but the bads, the suffering that a prospective life could have, count against creating it. Right. Okay. So this is, I believe, David Benatar might have been, or he's the most famous at least for proposing this asymmetry. I just want to read to you a quote from David Benatar about his own asymmetry. And
I think one thing that maybe Blake should have clarified here is that this is just one of many like axiologies that you can adopt when it comes to thinking about coming into existence. But like if you reject the because like a lot of people say, well, I just reject the asymmetry. And it's like, you need to lay out for them like, okay, well, you can do that, but you've got to pick one, right? Like you've got to back one of them. Especially if you're someone who's getting involved in these arguments, especially if you're someone who's thinking about reproducing yourself, because if you reproduce, you're implicitly endorsing at least one of them, right? So I think this always needs to be clarified with people, because I see a lot of people just say, oh, well, I just reject the asymmetry, and they just feel like they've won then. But you actually need to say to them like, okay, well, you can reject it if you want to, but you need to then say which one you get behind, why you get behind it, and then what that means is then you can start to interrogate the implications of the axiology they back, right? Because a lot of people say, well, I'm not going to back the axiological asymmetry, usually because it leads to it skews in favor of antinatalism, but if you pick another one, it will skew in favor of things that, at least in my view, are crazy and quasi-religious, and will lead to probably more harm done in the long run. But it then at least it's a debate you can have, right? Then at least it's a debate you can have. Whereas if you don't make that clear, the person may just say, I reject the asymmetry, and feel like they've kind of taken the high ground there. But if you're clear that they need to then defend whichever one they're going to back, then there's at least a debate to be had. They can't just reject it and then just walk away.
Hopefully, let me see if I can find it. I wrote it down. Adulterated. He's a very eloquent writer, okay? So he says, one of the implications of my argument is that a life filled with good and containing only the most minute quantity of bad, a life of utter bliss adulterated only by the pain of a single pinprick, is worse than no life at all. The objection is that this is implausible. It is true of the person enjoying this charmed life, marred only by a single brief, sharp pain, that as pleasant as his life is, it has no advantages over never existing. Yet coming into existence has the disadvantage of the single pain. We can acknowledge that the harm of coming into existence is minuscule without denying that it is a harm. If all lives were as free of suffering as that of the imagined person who suffers only a pinprick, the harms of coming into existence would easily be outweighed by the benefits to others, including the potential parents of that person coming into existence. So what Benatar is saying there is that if you hold this standard that the goods of a potential life do not count in favor of creating it, but the bads of a potential life do count against creating it, then it would then be wrong to create someone who would only suffer one pinprick in exchange for 70 years of happy bliss.
Well, that's not actually what he said, right? And he actually said the opposite of that. So again, this Percy guy seems to love extremes and also misunderstanding like quite clear things. So in that quote, Benatar literally says, if everyone who was brought into existence only had the harm of a pinprick, those harms could very easily be overcome by external considerations like the parent's desire to have a child. So in that case, it wouldn't be wrong to create that person. So that it's just like the complete opposite of what Percy has said that Benatar is saying there. Now, the only way that you could understand what Percy is saying is that in and of itself, it would be wrong, right? But that's even because you'd be, like if you ignore the sort of external things of like, the parents' interests and stuff like that, then just putting that pinprick on someone would be wrong. Now, many antinatalists may say that they still think it's a harm, but they may not think it's wrong. I don't know what Benatar would say on this, but many would say, like, is imposing a pinprick's worth of harm on someone wrong? I mean, yes, it's a harm, but is it wrong? It's such a small harm that the word wrong seems to be disproportionate. I'm not going to, if someone says it's wrong, I'm not going to argue with them, but like it's just like an insanely small harm, a pinprick, right? And if someone is to be created and only have the pinprick of a harm, by definition, there has to be someone who's going to create them. That person would create them because they have a desire to create them. And the fulfillment of their desire to create that person probably would outweigh the pinprick, right? So, in fact, from every angle that of what Percy just said, I feel like he's just sort of fallen flat on his face. Like he's just completely. He's not misquoted Benatar. He accurately quoted Benatar. If I haven't got the book in front of me, but I'm assuming he's read the quote accurately. But he's just completely misunderstood the what Benatar was saying.
That a plausible implication to you? And if it's not, then perhaps you should reject the asymmetry.
Yeah, no, it's the hardest pill to swallow in it, but it is still plausible for the reason that there is nobody there to be deprived of those pleasures. And since we cannot interrogate the unborn again to see if they are okay with this deal, there's basically the principle of do no harm that you have to, without consent, you have to take into account. So like an example is most people would agree that it is okay to harm someone in order to save them from a greater harm. So like you can break someone's arm in order to save them from a car crash where if you don't save them, they're going to burn alive. However, most people would agree that you cannot do the same thing to just bestow a benefit. So if someone walks up to you and says, hey, if you go break that guy's leg without telling him what's going on, I'll give him $100,000. Most people would agree you should not just go break that guy's leg. And so it's similar for bringing someone to existence. It's not okay to, we know that when you bring someone to existence, you're going to be causing harm. No one's going to be having a perfect life, even if that life is relatively good compared to everyone else's. But even if their life is good, you will be harming them, and it is not okay to harm them without their consent, even if there is goods within their life that you will be bestowing upon them by doing so.
Okay, now I think you're conflating two different arguments for antinatalism, so we need to keep them separate so we can address them one at a time. So one is the argument from an axiological asymmetry. I think that's completely independent from this additional argument you're making, which is the argument from consent. Because they're, yeah, okay.
Well, they're related in the sense that it helps with the specific issue that you just raised with the asymmetry, that even if the good outweighed the bad significantly, you would still have this issue to contend with, that it's not okay to hurt someone without their consent, even if you're giving them like $100 million in return.
Yeah, no, so I recognize that there are backups and there are fallbacks and other possible anti-natalist arguments, but I'm just focusing on the axiological asymmetry first because I take that to be an argument that stands on its own, which is saying that if it succeeds, then it would obviously make it wrong to reproduce, and so I need to give an answer to that before
sure,
I can address the consent point.
Well, not necessarily. This is the thing. Like, the axiological asymmetry in and of itself is not an argument for antinatalism. You have to have the axiological asymmetry with the coupled with the quality of life argument, right? Because the axiological asymmetry simply says that coming into existence is a harm, but antinatalism as a conclusion is derived from the magnitude of the harm. So like Benatar said, if coming into existence was just the harm of a pinprick, then basically no one would be an antinatalist. Well, to be fair, in the world we live in, basically no one's an antinatalist anyway, but you get what I mean. Out of all the antinatalists who are currently, who are antinatalist, there'll be much, much less of them if the harm was only a pinprick.
Okay, so this example comes from Jeff McMahon. He's an applied ethicist at Oxford who wrote, I think, a very powerful thought experiment that puts the axiological asymmetry to the test. Okay, so just remember, one of the implications that my opponent has embraced of the asymmetry argument is that the goods of a life do not count in favor of creating it, but the bads of a life count against creating it. Okay, so if you believe that's true, then consider this. You have two couples, okay? One couple will have the immortal child. The immortal child is a child who will go on to live an infinite number of years of bliss at the cost of one painful pinprick every year throughout that existence. So just overwhelming, unremitting joy and pleasure the entire time, but for that one setback. The other couple will bear the wretched child. The wretched child will go on to live 100 years in unremitting agony. He will be viscerally tortured and brutally brought to his knees until he dies in one final coup de grace. Okay. You have one contraceptive pill that you could give to one of the two couples. Now, remember, if you believe in the axiological asymmetry, then what that commits you to saying is that we should prefer to give our one contraceptive pill to the parents of the immortal child, because the parents of the immortal child will create a being who will suffer more in total than the wretched child will suffer.
How? He just said that kid would only have one pinprick, and the other kid would have 100 years of agony. What?
Total. And now, of course, that's going to sound counterintuitive, but the reason is because my opponent's committed himself to this implication that the goods of a life don't count in favor of creating it. Only the bads are relevant to procreation decisions. Okay, so if you believe that...
We're going to have to re-listen to that, because either I'm being really fucking stupid or Percy is on a mad one tonight.
Unremitting joy and pleasure the entire time, but for that one setback. The other couple... fallbacks and other possible anti-natalist arguments, okay. But I'm just focusing on the axiological asymmetry first, because I take that to be an argument that stands on its own, which is saying that if it succeeds, then it would obviously make it wrong to reproduce, and so I need to give an answer to that before I can address the consent point. Okay, so this example comes from Jeff McMahon. He's an applied ethicist at Oxford who wrote, I think, a very powerful thought experiment that puts the axiological asymmetry to the test. Okay, so just remember, one of the implications that my opponent has embraced of the asymmetry argument is that the goods of a life do not count in favor of creating it, but the bads of a life count against creating it. Okay, so if you believe that's true, then consider this. You have two couples, okay? One couple will have the immortal child. The immortal child is a child who will go on to live an infinite number of years of bliss at the cost of one painful pinprick every year throughout that existence. So just overwhelming...
Right. So it's not one pinprick; it's a pinprick every single year. Right. Okay. Now I get what he means. So because it's infinite, even though it's a very small harm, because it's times by infinity, it will be in total more harm than the kid who lives in agony for 100 years or whatever it was. So the thing I'd say to that is that the axiological asymmetry doesn't say about it. All it says is that the goods don't count in favor of bringing someone into existence, but the harms count against it. But it doesn't really say much about the nature of the harms, right? So if you're viewing these two examples through the lens of the axiological asymmetry, all your understanding is that both of those children will be harmed by their coming into existence. Now, the magnitude of that harm, that's a separate point, right? So you've got the axiological asymmetry that says they're both harmed, but the character and the magnitude of the harm is a separate point. Now, that is where in normal antinatalist debates you talk about the quality of life, right? In this example, he's giving two forms of harm. The pinprick every year or the 100 years of agony. He has just assumed that the axiological asymmetry prescribes an understanding of harm through the total amount of harm, right? Which is not what the axiological asymmetry does. So again, he's just kind of fallen on his face. Like, again, he must have a fetish for it or something. The axiological asymmetry merely posits that both of the individuals that this guy is talking about are harmed by their existence. He has made a leap from that to saying that the character of the harm must be just defined by its totality. But that's not necessarily the case. Some antinatalists may say that. Some antinatalists may say, yes, it is just the total amount of time over the whole lifespan that we should take into account. But other antinatalists may say it's the average intensity. Or something, or, you know, some other way that you can measure harm or something like that. Now, for me, my natural thoughts lie, or my natural judgment lies with the child who goes through the 100 years of agony being much worse a harm, even though the total amount is greater in the child who has the infinite bliss life, right? The nature of that harm is so subtle and spaced out that it doesn't seem to me as regretful as the 100 years of absolutely insane, intense, you know, debilitating pain. Now, people can argue that point, but that's separate from the axiological asymmetry. He's like, Percy has made an undue or unwarranted jump from the axiological asymmetry to this conclusion he's talking about.
Unremitting joy and pleasure the entire time, but for that one setback. The other couple will bear the wretched child. The wretched child will go on to live 100 years in unremitting agony. He will be viscerally tortured and brutally brought to his knees until he dies in one final coup de grace. Okay. You have one contraceptive pill that you could give to one of the two couples. Now, remember, if you believe in the axiological asymmetry, then what that commits you to saying is that we should prefer to give our one contraceptive pill to the parents of the immortal child, because the parents of the
which it doesn't.
Immortal child will create a being who will suffer more in total than the wretched child will suffer in total. And now, of course, that's going to sound counterintuitive, but the reason is because my opponent's committed himself to this implication that the goods of a life don't count in favor of creating it. Only the bads are relevant to procreation decisions. Okay, so if you believe that, then I put it to my opponent to explain to me, would you give the contraceptive pill to the parents of the immortal child or the parents of the wretched child?
The issue there is that it's subtly and sneakily changing the math from potential beings to existing beings, because that situation guarantees that we will have one of these beings actually existing. Once a being actually exists, that math changes. If you don't have a person who exists, who cannot be deprived of such goods, then those goods are not regrettable. However, if you have once you have a person that does exist, goods do matter for that person, and they can help outweigh the bad. So in that case, once we have guaranteed that one of these people must exist, the existing life of the person who's going to have an extremely awesome life with pinpricks every once in a while is going to be far preferable to the existing life of the person.
Oh yeah, that's true actually as well. I missed that when I was thinking about it. Is that you've changed it so that when you usually talk about antinatalism, you're only talking about potential beings, but here, one of these beings, it's baked into the thought experiment. One of them will exist. And when a being will exist, then the positives do count. Yeah.
Who is just going to be tortured miserably for 100 years. So since we have a guaranteed instance of one of those coming into a being, we don't just have two potential beings, we can just deny both if we want. In that case, the positive life there, the immortal child, is much preferable to the existing life of a tortured being.
Okay, I think that response is point missing. Okay, I think it's not understanding the example. Remember, what you said was, and I asked you the question, and you answered in the affirmative, that the goods of a potential life, the goods of a prospective, not yet created life, Do not.
Well, no, there's a difference between a not yet existing life and a potential life, right? So a potential life is a life that could exist, could not. It completely bears on our judgment. A not yet existing life is a life that will begin to exist. Emphasis on the word yet, right? If something is yet to happen, it means it will happen. Actually, I can think of some English language uses where yet doesn't mean something will happen. But in this context, it's implying that it will happen.
Count in favor of creating that life. But the bads of a potential.
Hey, Robert, as well. Also, antenatal lope. Henry wants right answers. I don't think I've missed anyone. Hey, everyone, thanks for joining.
Prospective life count against creating that life. You said that that was true. And then I asked you, okay, so what if I could create someone who we know with certainty will live a life of bliss at the cost of a single pinprick? And you said, yes, it would be wrong to create that person because the pain in that person's life will count against creating that person. So then I gave you Jeff McMahon's example of the immortal child and the wretched child. And now you're suddenly flipping the script and saying, actually, this is somehow not interacting with your asymmetry principle. I'm confused. How is it that your first answer to the first pinprick example is one thing, but then your answer to the wretched child, immortal child example is another thing?
Again, because this situation guarantees the existence of one of these two beings. And the math does change when you're talking about existing beings versus non-existing beings. Benatar says this, anyone who holds the axiological asymmetry agrees with this. Once you have existing beings,
but the question is not about
bad.
The question is not about what is good for beings once they already exist. What I'm asking is, which being should you prevent from being created? Okay, because they haven't been created yet. What I'm asking you is, we have two parents. Okay, they haven't had a child yet. They're planning on having a child, and you have a contraceptive pill, and you could give it to one or the other. And all you know about the hypothetical at this point is you have to come up with, based on what you know is going to happen, which person would you create? And so they haven't been created yet. Okay, and so then it's a matter of do you think that it's an attempt to hypothetically test this claim that you've made that the goods of a person's life don't count in favor of creating that person before they're created?
Right, but in the situation you're laying out, it is guaranteed that one of them will become an existent being. So when we're doing the math, we have to decide for this being that we know will exist, what is going to be worse and better for them. And when you're talking about an existing being, good things can help outweigh the bad. There is a person there that could be deprived of good. So if we have to have an existing being, and we have to choose between someone who's going to be tortured and someone who's going to get pinpricks, on the existing being math, it's easily you choose the person with the pinpricks. That's the problem with what you're presenting, is it guarantees an existing being. We're not just talking about non-existing beings. If we could just choose for both of them to not exist and actually just have non-existing beings remain in this equation, then yeah, let's say create neither.
Okay, but a being that we know will be created at some point in the future is not a being that exists. It's a being that will exist at some later point. Okay, so this is the same as me asking, do you not think it's possible to address the question?
Yeah, but there's a difference there, isn't there? There's a difference between if someone says, someone on the other side of the world is going to have a kid, and there's no way you can influence that, and the kid will be born in 9 months' time. Should we do things that are going to make the life of that kid go better? Everyone's going to say yes. That is completely different from if someone comes up to you and says, you can or cannot create a new person. Would you, putting things in place to make that the child, if you would create them, their life go better, is that a reason to create them? No. But if someone is going to exist, right, regardless of what we do, which is what Blake is saying there, then obviously we should put things in place to make their life go better. But that doesn't actually count as a reason to create them.
Of, should I create this being given advanced knowledge of what that being's life will be like?
It's, in your scenario, it sets up, so a crucial aspect of the non-existing being is that it truly is a purely hypothetical non-existing being. You have created a being that actually does positively exist in the future. And the time frame there is really relevant. This person will.
All right. So if this is going to be your objection, then we can just modify the example. Okay. So let's say we don't know with perfect certainty which parent will have a child, if either of them will. We just know that by giving a contraceptive pill to one of them, we reduce the chances that one of the parents will have their kid. Now I can reformulate the same basic question, just now it's a probabilistic question rather than a matter of certainty. Okay, so does that change your answer? Should you prefer to reduce the chances of a wretched child or an immortal child coming into existence?
No, it doesn't change it there, because that just makes it.
Yeah, exactly. It didn't change anything for me.
a probabilistic answer. We're still looking at the prospect of an actually existing being this way versus this way. Like I understand why you use that thought experiment. It makes it seem, but I don't think it actually pokes any holes, because it just changes it so that you
it doesn't achieve what the guy's hoping it to.
it obfuscates the fact that we're talking about an actually existing being, because you're telling me properties of these lives that are going to exist, and we're guaranteeing that one of them exists. And if you want to make it probabilistic, then fine, and we just take that into account and say, all right, well, this one probably will exist, so what should we do about it then? That doesn't really change the math there.
Okay, I just want to express my confusion, because I want to remind the audience that that moments before I posed Jeff McMahon's example, I gave a simpler example. Instead of choosing between two different beings, it was just choosing one being to be brought into existence. And I said,
you actually have non-existence on the table.
Okay, but wait. So what I said was, we're going to bring this one being into existence, and it will suffer one pinprick at the cost, which is the cost for this amazing life that it will have.
Correct.
Okay, so are you saying? Okay. Yeah, okay. Can you just explain one more time? Why is it that like that?
So that first
why
one,
were you Yeah, okay.
That first one, you gave it the options of existence versus non-existence. The second one, you gave the option of existence of this being versus existence of this being. In your second thought experiment, non-existence is not an option. It's just existence of two different possible beings.
Well, to be clear, the immortal child versus the wretched child example is not existence of this versus that. It's creation of this versus creation of that. So the examples talking about...
Okay, yeah, but it's the same thing.
Who should we bring into existence who doesn't yet currently exist, not whose life is good once they already exist. It seems pretty clear to me that the asymmetry, if it's correct...
The whole point of antinatalism is about choosing to create someone, to bring them into existence, right? But his example completely misses that, because there's no choice as to whether you can bring someone into existence, because his thought experiment is saying you have to bring someone into existence. You just get to choose who.
Correct, and we're taking David Benatar seriously, implies that you shouldn't have this preference in favor of creating the wretched child. You shouldn't have a preference toward creating the immortal child, or sorry, his asymmetry implies that you should prefer to create the immortal child, because that creates a being with it implies, okay, I'm sorry, I got a little mixed up. It implies that you should prefer to create the immortal child just because it would have, or sorry, that you should prevent the creation of the immortal child because it will have a greater amount of disutility as opposed to the wretched child. But that just seems counterintuitive, and the reason is because it seems obvious that the potential pleasures counts in favor of creating something. Anyway, okay. I'm sorry for getting mixed up there.
No worries.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we're kind of at an impasse there. I don't have any recourse but to sort of just reiterate my points for that one. So why don't we go into the points about what I call playing offense. Okay, so I had some arguments that were supposed to challenge your views on the quality of life argument for antinatalism. So can you explain to me, like, why is it that you have, or first of all, do you think you have a duty to save a child that's drowning in a pond?
Yes.
Okay.
That's an existing.
Why
being
though?
That's an existing being with interests that should be considered, and we do want to save that child not only for its own sake, but definitely for its own sake, and also because its mom will be very sad if it dies, probably.
Okay. All right, first of all, let's just stipulate away the second order effects of the child. So let's talk about just the child on their own. Let's suppose that the mother's not in the picture. Maybe she died. Okay. Maybe she already drowned. All right, but you've just got a child that you can go in and save. Do you think for the sake of that child herself, you should go in and save her?
Yeah, because it's still an existing being with interests, and I appeal to the principle of autonomy in this instance. So for people that do exist, it's not really like I shouldn't be the one that decides whether or not their lives are worth continuing. If they want to continue their lives despite the fact that their lives are wretched, that's on them. That's up to them. But that math does not apply for non-existing beings who do not have that autonomy. We must make that decision for them.
Okay. All right. So I'm just going to focus on the quality of life argument that you made. So that argument was saying that our lives are so bad they're not worth living. What do you think of my principle that says that you don't have a duty to give someone?
If anyone wants to know my thoughts on this, I'm not going to say it again, but when he first presented this in his introduction, I gave my thoughts on it. So if you've missed that, you can go back to the start and see that.
A cure that's worse than the disease. Does that seem plausible to you?
You don't have a duty to give someone a cure that's worse than the disease?
Yes.
Yeah, that's not plausible.
Okay. So if our lives aren't worth living, then when you reach into the pond to save the child, you're not actually leaving them better.
Well, again, one thing that hasn't been brought up yet, but this guy keeps on tripping over, is the difference between life worth continuing, life worth starting, because he keeps saying life worth living. But that is ambiguous between those two things.
Off. You're leaving them worse off because you're subjecting them to a continuation of a life that's not worth living.
If somebody wants the cure that's worse than the disease, do you think you should give it to them?
I think our intuitions are going to be that especially if it's a severely irrational choice or it's like very bad for them to take the drug, you at a minimum don't have a duty to give that person that drug. Okay, so remember I gave to give a very extreme example just to make the intuition obvious. Let's say you have a dying man and I'm just a civilian, so I don't have like a contract with the person. I'm just and I have a drug that
Oh, T3 ST has just done a super chat of $1. Thank you so much, T3ST, with no message or question or anything. But thank you so much for the support. I hope you're enjoying the debate and Percy trip over himself time and again.
For some reason, irrationally, that person wants me to give them. But what the drug will do is it'll induce major depressive disorder, plus locked-in syndrome, plus like akathisia and a bunch of other horrible tortures that the medical world can cause you, and then it'll just prolong their suffering and then until they have a grisly death. Okay.
Yep.
Do you think I have an obligation to provide that drug to that person?
So here's where the analogy breaks down, or here's what you need to add to the analogy to make it actually analogous. You need to make it so that if I don't give this person this drug, they're going to die now without the choice. And if I just give it to them right now, then they can actually choose to take the antidote tomorrow if they want. That's totally up to them. But if I don't give it to them right now, they're not going to have any choice in the matter. They're just going to die. That's what would actually make it analogous. If I save this person and they decide they want to kill themselves tomorrow, that's on them.
Okay, so wait, so you think I do have an obligation to give the person the drug?
If once you adjust the analogy like that, then yes.
Really? Okay, so it's a drug that's worse than the disease. You're saying I have a duty to give them this drug that will be worse for them than the disease that they're already suffering from.
If they're going to die immediately without it and they have the option later to undo your drug, then yes.
Okay. I don't share your intuition. I don't think you have. I think
Really?
you could say maybe, well, so, I mean, you could say that like it might not be wrong to give them the drug, but that's not my claim. I'm not saying it's wrong on antinatalism to save a drowning child. I'm just saying you are, you simply lack an obligation. You don't have an obligation to give the person the drug.
I think under that situation you do.
Really?
Yeah, like if I can give you a drug that will save you from a heart attack right now, you're going to die right now if I don't give you the drug, but the drug's going to have terrible side effects. But you can give yourself an antidote tomorrow for those side effects if you want to. I think I absolutely have a moral duty to give you that drug so you can make that decision tomorrow for yourself.
Yeah, and remember, it's also, those side effects aren't novel. Because in this analogy, the side effects are things they've been living with their whole life and chose to continue existing. So you're simply just, they are having a heart attack, right? So basically, they have all these side effects, right? They have a heart attack, and you're just bringing them back to where they were, and they're going to continue, right? That's all that's happening in this thought experiment.
Okay, but the point of the example was to highlight that if we stipulate that the drug will actually make the person worse off having taken it than they would have been had they not taken it. So like I give the person a drug and or let's say I throw the life raft to the child and the life raft is covered in a toxin that will, when they touch it, will give them this horrific, horrible disease that will make their lives worse overall. Mm-hmm. Do you have an obligation to throw that life raft to the child?
If that's the only life raft I have and they're going to die otherwise, and once I pull them on the boat, they can choose to...
Yeah, and also in his, like this guy, Percy's thought experiment, so the picture he's painted is you have this kid, they're living their life, they fall in a pond, you're able to help them, but if you help them, you make their situation, their general life much, much worse, because if you are, you've saved their life, but their quality of life is worse, because that's implied in what he's saying, because you're throwing them a life raft with, he said there was some horrible disease on it. Presumably they didn't have the disease before, otherwise you throwing them that life raft, they wouldn't catch the disease the second time, they would just still have it, right? So built into his thought experiment is that you save this person, but you drastically reduce their quality of life, which makes it very unappealing, because it seems as though you're imposing a novel burden or something on them, right? Which isn't the case. You're just simply bringing them back to their normal quality of life. You're just saving their life, and they then go on their merry way, right? Like, you aren't imposing some sort of novel burden on them, which is implied in his thought experiment by the fact you give them a disease. That's not equivalent to what you actually do in real life.
They have some antidote to that toxin, then yeah, I absolutely have a duty to throw that life preserver.
Wait, but what? Okay, so I'm a little confused why it's important that they have to have an antidote to the toxin. I'm just trying to, like, so wait, hold on, are you saying... Wait, that's true.
If I save your life,
right, okay,
I haven't like doomed you to live for the rest of your natural life. You can still kill yourself tomorrow. I'm just preserving your choice to do so.
Okay. All right, so I still think your position is counterintuitive because you could right now, I mean, if this is really how you feel, you could just start finding fake cures to different diseases and just looking for willing takers. But I don't think you have an obligation to do that. So like, why aren't you doing that?
In the analogy, this wouldn't be a fake cure. We're talking about saving someone's life to preserve their ability to choose whether or not.
Well,
they continue living their life. That is a real cure.
It's a worse off making cure because when you take it, you subject yourself to a worse condition than you were already in.
No,
which is what happens.
They were in the condition of life. So they were.
I'm a little confused. Do you not think it's worse for a drowning child to be saved than it is for the child to die?
It is potentially worse for them. Yeah. I mean, it's probably like just on like a hedonic view, it is probably worse for them.
It completely depends on your view of death, like if you're Epicurean or not, and it also depends on what the quality of life of that person is, right? Again, this is all stuff that I covered when I first made my comments on this at the start of the stream.
But the principle of autonomy, I think, is important here. Like, if you want to continue living your shitty life, I do not think I have the right or moral obligation to prevent you from doing so. You, an existing being, have that autonomy and choice. So I value that choice, and I want to preserve that. So if someone else is about to die in an accident, the fact that they haven't killed themselves leading up to this point signals to me that they want to continue living. So I'm going to save them, and if it turns out I was wrong, that's fine. They can kill themselves tomorrow.
Okay, so you think you have an obligation to give someone a drug which you believe in expectation will make them worse off if they take it.
If it's that or die, and they can undo.
But it won't make them worse off. How does it make them worse off? He's just assuming that. I don't understand how it makes them worse off. It simply returns them to the quality of life that they had before, right? So if anything, it just maintains what they were on. It can't make them worse off.
That later, yes.
And even if dying as opposed to taking the drug would be better for them.
Yes.
Okay. All right. I guess I'll appeal to the audience. I don't know what you guys make of that exchange, but I don't find that very plausible. I don't think, to be clear, I don't think you have a duty to give this defective drug to someone. I just think that you have.
Well, do you really not? Like in the way that I laid out the analogy, if you come up on, if they're about to die, if you don't inject them with this, and they're just like gasping, you can't like ask them about it. They're just gasping on the ground. If I give them this drug, they will survive, and they'll be worse off. Their life will be shitty, but they can choose to undo that tomorrow if they want to. You don't think that's a problem, or you don't think that there's a moral obligation to give the drug?
So like in our world, I don't think their life isn't worth living. So of course I would want to help the person. But in your example.
Oh my God, they really just need to hash out the difference between a life worth starting and a life worth continuing. Oh my God.
I'm stipulating that the quality of life argument for antinatalism is true, which is what I'm challenging with the example. If that's true, then yeah, I mean, this just sounds like I'm not in a position to save them in a meaningful sense, because when I lift the person out, I'm actually making them worse off than they were initially. So I guess one question this leads me to is, do you think there's a distinction between a life worth starting and a life worth continuing?
Yeah, absolutely.
Finally.
Okay. Can you explain why?
Because basically everyone can kind of judge for themselves whether or not they think their life is worth continuing. Like if you, even if your life is pervaded like mostly by suffering, but you really want to see the Avatar 3, you can choose to keep living, and you can choose yourself that your life is worth continuing for that reason. But a life worth starting is different, because if we, any life we start, we are sure will be pervaded by some amount of suffering. But if we don't start that life, any pleasure they will have had, they will not be deprived thereof. There's no person there to be deprived of any pleasure. Maybe another reason to kind of explain why this is important is because some people think that like the center of the bullseye for morality is pleasure. But I don't think that's the case. I think it's the person that matters. Pleasure is Pleasure is good because it helps make people's lives go better than they would have otherwise. Pleasure in itself is not just this nebulous, valuable entity. It's good because it makes people's lives go better. So if you don't have a person there to be deprived of that pleasure, there is no issue. There is no moral wrongness in not having a person there to be deprived of said possible pleasure.
It's interesting to me that you value so much the autonomy of a person to make a choice about whether they should be saved or not, because I recall that earlier in the debate you remarked that people just aren't reliable judges of the quality of their life. They're subject to cognitive biases.
That's correct, and that matters for whether or not we choose to start new lives, because there's no autonomy.
Yeah, I don't know why that confuses him, because they're two separate things. Like, you can say people should have autonomy to make their own decisions, but also say that they may not necessarily be the most reliable judges of what their quality of life is. Like, you can say, yeah, people are the best judge of their quality of life, right? But, like, I still want them to have the autonomy to make the decisions, because if their lives were controlled externally, it would probably make their quality of life perhaps worse, because of, the loss of the locus of control and all of this sort of stuff. And also there would just be like loads of other factors, like it's just politically unfeasible.
That we need to respect of the non-existent. So that doesn't come into the equation. What all that matters there is, all right, do we think this life here is worth starting? There is no autonomy to ask to. So let's find out. Let's think about this rationally. But for an existing being, there is an autonomous agent there that we need to consider. So it's not just the pure calculus. It's also, do we respect this person? And that's another reason why like the person is kind of more important than just the pure presence of pleasure or pain. The person is worthy of moral consideration. They should be treated as an end, not a mere means. They're not just a vessel for pleasure and pain. So I respect their autonomy. I can't respect the autonomy of a being that doesn't exist. That doesn't make sense.
Okay. All right. So you, okay. So do you think it's rationally permissible on antinatalism, given the quality of life argument you made, given the fact that our lives are abjectly miserable and not worth living, to not commit suicide?
Is it, I'm sorry, did you say is it moral not to commit suicide?
Is it rational not to commit suicide, given your view?
Is it rational not to commit suicide? I would say, what that word means there is kind of hard to determine. Like I would say that you can choose to like keep living for any number of reasons, even if you have a shitty life. Like I don't think necessarily all like slaves that didn't kill themselves are rational, even though they like pretty objectively had miserable lives. But like if you mean like rational in the sense of are they doing the pure calculus of pleasure versus pain and choosing wrong, then I guess you could say that it's irrational.
Okay. Well, it seems. Well, you know, so like David Ventar likes to give this example to motivate your distinction between a life not worth starting, but a life worth continuing anyway. Where he says it's sort of like watching a bad play. Like it wasn't worth starting the play, but it's worth sitting through to the
I think it was actually a film, but
end of the play. Do you kind of find that a useful analogy?
Yeah, like that could motivate.
I think it's not. I don't think it's perfectly analogous, but I think it can be useful.
At least some like subset of people that, yeah, like if you go into a movie and you realize the movie's not that great, but you now still have like a vested interest in seeing how it ends, and you're like, all right, I guess I'll stick around. But in retro, you reflect later, man, if I'd known how bad that movie was going to be, I definitely would not have gone. Like I totally think that is like a rational person. It's possible to find yourself in that situation.
Okay, I can understand how that example might intuitively resonate with some people, but I think it fails for a couple of reasons. So one reason is like I still need to be able to reasonably expect that if I remain in the theater, that will be better for me than leaving the theater, even if the positives will only just barely compensate me for the negatives. Because otherwise you're committing the classic sunk cost fallacy, which is, you know, if the expected value is negative, it would make sense for me to just cut my losses. And that applies both to...
So this is why it isn't perfectly analogous. The first thing is that when you go to the cinema, you're going to the cinema because you have a pre-established interest in going to watch good films. You expect it to be a good film. That's not the case for coming into existence. Someone else has to force you into it, and there's no pre-existing desire. The other thing is that in the cinema, right, that you don't have death anxiety keeping you there, but in what do you call it? So someone would say, you know, sunk cost fallacy, but in real life, you can't really claim it's sunk cost fallacy. Like that's all that's going on there, because you know, people may, you know, you may view it as continuing to exist is a harm if you view it like that, but it may be the lesser of two harms, the greater harm being death, and you have death anxiety around that, right?
Continuing to watch a play and continuing to live. So Benatar's quality of life argument can't succeed without entailing the rationality of suicide. So the thought here is just kind of like, if you have some reason to think all the good parts of or the worst parts of life are concentrated at the very beginning, then I can understand this idea that like life is worth continuing but not worth starting. But that's not really the situation we're in. It's more like I'm assuming you think the bad things are suffused throughout life, and if anything, they're concentrated at the end. So I would think that a life worth starting would be a life worth continuing, and vice versa, until we had some good reason to think differently. And so it's sort of the burden of proof is on you to explain why we should distinguish those things. Like imagine that play was going to go on for 20 years. Would you not just get up and leave? Like,
there's just different considerations. Like you might have to consider like, oh, if I kill myself, then my parents will be sad. And they're like, in the real world, there's all sorts of different considerations that might want to make a person stick around. But even like, it's also just very possible that people are just largely irrational. I think most people probably agree that most people are largely irrational. That's not really an issue. The issue, because of the principle of autonomy, is we're not here to try to tell people like, hey, you're being irrational, kill yourself. We're worried about non-existing beings that we are potentially bringing in to this hellscape. If you want to stick around this hellscape, that's all on you. That's fine. That's not my job to get you out of it. But it is my job to not, of my own volition, bring a new being into this hellscape.
Okay. It's sort of weird because I guess you're kind of just embracing my point. Oh, hold on. Sorry, I'm getting called. That might have messed up my audio.
Nope, you're good.
Messed up my audio. Hold on, give me a sec.
We can hear you.
Okay, I can hear you now.
All right.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so are you embracing my conclusion that antinatalism on the quality of life argument implies that suicide is rational, or is
No, what I'm saying is not necessarily.
compelled?
Like, I definitely think it implies that some people's lives are not worth continuing. I doubt that it can. I'm not sure. I'm not convinced whether or not it implies that like everyone's lives are not technically worth continuing. In fact, I think it probably doesn't, just because there's other things.
Does anyone? There's 33 people watching at the moment. Does anyone know who this Blake guy is? I've never come across him. I don't know who he is, but yeah, it'd be interesting to see. Like, does he create content or anything like that? Does anyone know anything about him?
Consider like how sad it makes other people that would be sad if you're passing. But my major point is that it doesn't really matter either way, because we're just arguing, is it wrong to bring new lives into being? Not should you kill yourself? If that is one of the implications, so be it. I think it probably isn't. But if we agree, as long as we agree that you shouldn't bring new beings into existence, we can talk another day about whether or not that means you should kill yourself too.
Well, the reason it's relevant is because if our lives are worth continuing, that actually might be evidence for thinking that our lives are also worth starting, right? And if so, like, that raises the chances that our lives are worth starting if they're also worth continuing.
No, I
That
wasn't
seems
being pushed in
plausible
that
to me.
direction at all. I was more being like, the points you were making were seeming more like, yeah, you might be able to make the point that they're actually not worth continuing either. I didn't see any points there suggesting that, oh, maybe they actually are worth continuing, therefore they're worth starting too.
Well, this is kind of like a modus tollens thing. The idea is like, if antinatalism, or if the quality of life argument for antinatalism is true, then our lives are not worth living. If our lives are not worth living, then we should commit suicide. However, we should not commit suicide. Therefore, antinatalism is false. Right? Therefore, the quality of life argument is false. That would be kind of the structure of the syllogism.
Yeah, that's not. It's not the direction you're going with it. I just don't think it's because you were going more in the direction like as you were pushing me, you were trying to say like, yeah, it sounds like we should just kill ourselves. And antinatalism is totally fine with like it could be the case. Promortalism and antinatalism like could be the same thing. Like you could be an antinatalist and also think you should kill yourself. There's no contradiction there.
Okay. All right. So what did you think of my point about pregnant mothers having a duty to have an abortion on antinatalism? Because life isn't worth living.
That just comes down to like abortion ethics of how far, like, is a fetus in the third trimester like a life with is it conscious? Is it does it have desires worth protecting? Does it have like rights worth protecting? If it is, then there's no more reason to abort it than there is to kill a 20-year-old. If it isn't, then like if you're talking about like before the fetus becomes conscious and is not a person yet, then yeah, you should totally abort it.
Okay. All right. So there is okay. Well, then I'll appeal to the audience and say, to the extent that you think women do have a moral permission to have to gestate to term, then this would count as evidence against his view.
I'm telling them not to have kids at all. So I mean, yeah, like yeah, it's entailed for sure.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So then let's talk about my claim that if antinatalism is true, then we should pursue a campaign of mass involuntary sterilization, especially of Orthodox Jews. All right. So you'll remember the way that argument went was basically I started with this claim that I think is with a plausible general principle, which is you don't have a right to something which you could only use and which you will foreseeably use to exercise in order to violate other people's rights or to commit a severe injustice. Okay, do you agree with that principle?
Yeah. So, like this line of argument, I don't really think it helps. And like the analogy here is like if we all decided, we're back in the 1700s and we decide slavery is bad, we should probably stop doing this. But it turns out that for some reason the only way to stop slavery is to press this button that just like incinerates all the current slaves. We could be like, oh fuck. Incinerating slaves is totally not good. What do we do about this? But it definitely doesn't follow that if it is bad to incinerate slaves, therefore slavery is good. And this is the same argument. Like, does this entail that we should like forcibly sterilize people? You can have an argument about that, but that doesn't have any effect on whether or not antinatalism is true. Like, it could in fact be the case that antinatalism is true and this sucks, and now we're just left in the same position of the people that don't like slavery, but the only way out of it is to incinerate the slaves. We're just in a pickle. Okay,
let's go through each step, and then let's figure out where specifically you're coming off the ship with me. Okay, so the first premise was, and I think you said yes to it, but I'll ask it again, okay, just to be sure. If a person does not have a right to something which they will foreseeably and which they could only use in order to violate other people's rights or commit a severe injustice. Do you agree with that? Like, and I gave the example in my opening statement about like a suitcase nukes. Like, I don't have a right to a suitcase nuke because the only plausible use that I could put that to is to kill people or to commit grave rights violations.
The only thing you can do with it, I mean, I guess, yeah, you wouldn't have a right to that very specific thing, I guess. I'll roll with you.
Okay. All right. So then the next step is going to be our reproductive functions are both in the case of Orthodox Jews, because they have a very high rate of fertility, they tend to have about 5 children on average. The reproductive functions of Orthodox Jews will foreseeably and can only be used in order to gravely violate and commit severe injustices against the rights of their descendants. because they'll have children and their children will have children, and et cetera, leading to thousands of descendants because of the law of exponential growth.
Okay.
Do you agree?
Yeah,
Okay.
like if they could not otherwise be reasoned out of it, and if you're just stipulating that any attempts we make at reasoning them out of this fail, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so then the next step is, therefore, so now that would be a conclusion if we're going to do this as a formal presentation of the argument. The conclusion statement would be, therefore, Orthodox Jews do not have a right to their reproductive functions. So you agree with that?
They do not have a right. So that.
Yeah, but there's a difference between a moral and a legal right.
The rights argument is more complicated. If you're talking about like legal rights, like should they have like a legal right to
moral rights? Moral rights.
Exactly. So yeah, now they're making the distinction. Yeah, I would say they don't have a moral right to, but a legal right, yeah.
Well, I mean, then no.
Or legal rights. I mean, either one, I guess. It could be both, right? I don't think you would have either because the morality would take precedence.
Yeah, like if we're all convinced of antinatalism, like you can't have a moral right to do harm, right? To do a great harm to other people. So right. Yeah, that would entail.
Okay, so Orthodox Jews do not have a right to their reproductive functions. Okay, the next step of my argument is going to be.
Also, just to say hey to a few new people. Discombobulator, Jameson, it stands to reason, Uncle Shale's neck vein, and Woomiverse Art Studio. Welcome to the chat, everyone.
The right. So if you don't have a right to something and you're going to use it foreseeably to commit vast, severe injustices, then the state or the rest of society has a right to seize it from you by force, if necessary. Is that
right? And this is what I'm saying. This is analogous to what I was saying with the slaves. Like, we all know that people derive much like great happiness from having kids. It's biologically hardwired into us. If it wasn't, we wouldn't be here today. So we know that trying to convince people to stop having kids will create some harm. Just like we know that pressing that button to end slavery is going to incinerate these slaves and cause a lot of harm. Maybe we decide that sucks so hard that it's not worth pressing the button. I don't know. But it does not in any way change the fact that our early agreement that like slavery is wrong. And this doesn't change anything about the fact that that antinatalism is correct if we're presuming this. Like it could totally be the case that antinatalism is correct, and we also just all look at this situation and say, yeah, this sucks a lot. Like that's fine.
Okay. Well, let me explain why on the side of the ledger let me explain why I think that on your view there really is the strong reason to sterilize these Orthodox Jews. The idea is basically, like I said earlier, if a person reproduces 5 times today, they set in motion a chain of rights violations that will amount to an exponential contribution to the human population within a few generations, because each of their children will have another several children, and each of their children will have another several children. At a minimum, you're going to get a couple thousand rights violations and severe injustices committed. And so what I'm putting to you is basically this question, like, if in expectation you can prevent an enormous number of rights violations and injustices by killing or sterilizing one person, then is it not plausible that you can do that to that person, especially if the first step of enacting that chain of injustices is itself a culpable act of injustice?
It's plausible, but even if that's plausible, I don't like it, because you could just ask the question like to.
Yeah, even in isolation, if that's a plausible argument, it's not plausible in the real world.
The other direction, like, hey, we know this person over here is going to go down into their basement and create a whole bunch of beings and torture them. Like, do we have the right to like stop them from doing that? Yes. But then when you pose it this other way, that just feels less intuitively right to people. Like, I can see people being pulled by that, but I think it just leaves you in the same situation. Do you think we have a moral duty to press the incinerate the slaves button to end slavery? It's like, it sucks, but it doesn't in any way affect the argument that slavery is bad. Okay.
Why don't we, okay, so I'm just moving through what I asked in the opening statement. So there was another argument I wanted to share with you. I claim that your position might depend on your background assumptions, so we'll find out. But it seems like you might think, if you're an antinatalist for the reasons my opponent says he is, that you shouldn't resurrect a little girl who dies in a car accident along with her family if they're the only affected parties. Okay. Where do you stand on that?
Should you resurrect? So this is another problem that often comes up when like people will ask, like, so do you think that would have been better if you didn't exist? And the issue with that question is like the human mind can't really conceive of that notion. So like if someone asks you would it have been better if you didn't exist, what you're really just imagining in your head is like the cessation of existence of you or the already existing being. So I think your question just kind of muddles that line in a similar way, where it's like you're saying this person ended, but not really, because they can continue if they want. I think it's just kind of like a dressed up version of the same question that you asked earlier of do we have the right to save someone? Like I think it just comes down to, do we save them or not? You're saying that this person's life has already started. We have the ability to save it from ending or like remaining ended. And continue. We have the ability to make this person's lives continue. Should we do it? I would say yes, because I would rather them have the choice of whether or not they want to end it. If they want to end it after I save them, go for it.
Okay. So you're leaning towards saying you should resurrect the girl if you have the
Yeah,
chance.
because I think it's secretly just the should you save a life case. I think it's like identical to that one in all practical sense.
Well, but remember, she doesn't exist anymore, right? So it's not saving a life because she's dead.
I know. That's why you say that, but no one's really, when you say that, no one's actually imagining a person that stopped existing. We're like imagining someone who's like heart stopped. Like this person existed. Sally existed. She has already begun to exist. She's like flatlining right now. We have the ability to continue her life or not, do we? We're not talking about a non-existent being, a being that has never existed. We're talking about Sally. Sally exists. Sally existed. Do we want to help her continue existing so that she can choose whether or not to stop existing? It's a separate question from should we bring a non-existent being into existence?
I'm surprised that's your answer. I mean, I think you're guilty of a failure of imagination. So you can speak for yourself when you say that we can't imagine it. I mean, I can certainly imagine it. It's not hard for me to imagine. What you were saying, well, okay, I don't know how to refute an incredulous stare, to quote David Lewis.
I mean,
yeah, okay. Well, so I don't think that it's hard to imagine a person stopping existing and then we reinstate their existence at a later time.
I don't think that's hard to imagine at all either. It's hard to imagine having never existed, which is what that scenario is trying to equate to.
Yeah, okay. Right, okay. I still kind of think, like the person doesn't exist anymore. What exactly would you be appealing to justify bringing them back into existence? Is it the goods of their lives that they'll potentially have if they exist, even though they're not yet there to enjoy them? Because I thought you believed that the pleasures of a potential life don't count in favor of making it so that life is instantiated. It only the pain counts to whether you bring them into existence.
It's Sally's existence,
but she doesn't exist when she's dead, right?
And her existence in a time-independent frame.
All right, I don't know if I fully understand what you're saying there, but I'm not going to fight it obsessively.
Sally did exist. Sally is a being. Sally is a referent. We can reference Sally. We cannot reference a non-existent being. That's the important distinction there.
I mean, it sounds like she doesn't exist if she's dead, but whatever. So. But I'm just okay. I say so, I guess. All right. I guess one thing I probably neglected to mention at the beginning when we were talking about the social science of just like how like you appeal to social science evidence, I appeal to social science evidence as to just like how good our lives are. Is the convergent validity of the self-report measure for happiness. So your argument, as I understand, is basically the self-report measure for happiness is a really bad measure because it just isn't credible in the face of like the Pollyanna principle. So it's like, okay, so that was the argument. Well, so this is one of the arguments for why Steven Pinker, in his book Enlightenment Now, he's a psychologist at Harvard, says that actually we can trust self-report data on happiness. Other than just saying, who's a better judge than the person themselves, there's also the fact that a person who scores high on a self-report measure of happiness, also their score is correlated heavily with how much they smile, how often they laugh, how much the people in their lives subjectively opine that they seem like a happy person. So there's cross corroboration between multiple different expected outcomes for this measure. That's what social scientists and psychometrics call construct convergent validity. One last thing. There's also neuroimaging evidence that validates the measure of self-report, which is that there are these regions in the brain that neuroscientists have established are involved in the production of positive emotion. And what they find is that when a person has self-reports of being especially happy, there's actually a greater amount of baseline activity in those regions in their brain that respond to like cute puppy pictures and pictures of fond memories and the taste of delicious ice cream, et cetera, et cetera. So what do you make of my convergent validity case, my kind of converging lines of evidence in favor of self-report measures of happiness?
Yeah, so I'm in Now Great Book. He gets lots of grasp about how everything is getting better. But the issue there is that, it's not at all surprising that people that have actually lived happier lives report happier lives. That they just have people that have lived happier lives than those that haven't, even if they're also using the Pollyanna principle, they still have to delude themselves less than the people that are much sadder than them. So they all of the people in that group could have net negative lives, but the people you're comparing within the group. So you're just saying that, these people that are the happiest people within this group report greater happier than the saddest people in this group. Sure, that has no bearing on whether or not the Pollyanna principle is true. It could be that they are all deluded when looking at their past lives and thinking that it's happier than it is sad. But just within that group, there are people that some are a little bit happier and some are a little sadder. That doesn't really help answer that question.
Okay, so it sounds like the objection is that the samples aren't representative. So I have taken a look at these studies no, so they do actually. So it's not like they're only looking at happy people. They're looking at a representative cross section of the American population.
Right.
I think some of this evidence is done in developing countries, but I'm focusing on this one, Tyler 2009. Okay, basically the idea is that as their self-reports go, like the people with low self-reported happiness, you go and you ask their friends, do they seem like they smile a lot? Do they laugh a lot? Like all these questions. And you can build in other questions about the person to keep it from having a framing effect or cueing the respondent to like exaggerate how happy they seem. And what you find is their employers, their teachers, their friends, their family tend to say that if they self-reported as being unhappy, they didn't laugh as much, they didn't smile as much, and they just didn't seem to carry themselves with buoyancy. But then vice versa, if the person self-reported as being very happy, then you did see this corroboration, all the expected things. So do you agree basically with the methodology, the idea that like if lots of different measures find the same thing and they correlate with each other, then that raises the chances that any one of those measures is actually tracking like the fact of the matter?
Right. Yeah, that's not the issue. I think it's a representative sample, or at least I haven't seen the data. I'm assuming it's a representative sample. That's not the issue. The issue is that it tells us nothing about whether or not the Pollyannism principle is in effect. It could be that the happiest people in this survey still have net negative lives that they believe are positive because of Pollyannism, but they still like they still might be like, let's say, just for like the extreme case, we have like a kid who's starving in Africa, and we have like you who's like living a nice life in the first world. Let's just say that for the sake of argument, it is the case that your life is still mostly net negative. But it's still like considerably better than like the kid in Africa. All that your like the studies you're saying show is that you are living a happier life than the kid in Africa. No, I'm not contesting that. That could totally be the case. Probably is the case. But the point is that tells us nothing about whether or not your life actually is net positive, you being at the top of this ladder, or if you're using Pollyannism and it's still net negative, and then the African child is just way even worse than you.
At this point, I just think I can charge you with not being intellectually responsible enough to use like a Bayesian framework with probability. And the way I'm going to try to vindicate that charge is just by saying, I strongly suspect that if the evidence went the other way, you would be citing it, not me. Okay, you wouldn't be saying like, so well, let me explain what I mean by that. Like, let's say that actually when you ask people how happy are you on a scale from 1 to 10, people overwhelmingly said 2, 1, 1, 2, 3, 2, and it like it was heavily concentrated around the very low end of the scale. People, in other words, were saying my life is very closely approximating the worst possible life as opposed to the best possible life. And then you found that everyone that this measure was heavily correlated with how often people cry and how often they grimace and how often they seem to carry themselves with a depressive aura. Wouldn't you consider that evidence for your view?
If there was, so the issue is that there's not like a reverse Pollyannism effect that we would need to consider. So like if that was the case, I mean, yes, I guess I could cite that because that would just mean that life is so terrible that even with Pollyannism, people are still reporting that it's absolute dog shit. So I guess so. But if there was like this noted psychological effect that's well studied and well agreed upon in the literature, that was the reverse of Pollyannism, you could purport that as well. You could say, oh, well, people reporting their lives are bad, but as we know, they tend to underreport their happiness all the time.
Yeah, I guess at this point, my question is just, what is the effect size of the Pollyanna effect?
So I'm actually just flabbergasted that this is being contested. I would have prepped for this part specifically.
Wait, hold on. I'm not asking whether it exists. I'm asking what's the magnitude of the effect.
I understand that. What I'm saying is I've never like argued with someone that actually believed that people had net positive lives on average. Like that's like when you take into account like your actual day-to-day life of just how much of it is spent struggling towards some goal versus the small amount of time, relatively speaking, spent enjoying the success of that goal. And that's just like in like relatively like blessed lives, not even mentioning the fact that 99% of the world is like living in a household income less than like 30 something K and all of the other like miseries that are entailed by disease and all that stuff. I've never actually encountered someone that just like completely rejected that current lives are on average net negative. Like the standard, like a more standard response to like the Benatar objection is like, okay, well, yeah, like that's now, but what if in the future we can actually create lives that through advanced technology and neuroscience that actually are net positive in the future? Like what then? I've never actually heard someone just like try to claim now that they are definitely not net negative on the whole.
Okay, I mean, well, so if you've never heard it, then you're just living in a like an abject circle jerk, like no one is in an echo chamber, okay? Because go and meet like an average person and ask them if their life is on average worth living or on average is a positive experience. They're going to tell you overwhelmingly yes. I have billions of people to give to introduce you to, namely by looking at the Our World in Data research on how many people are happy. So like you saying I've never heard this before is it just shows how incredibly parochial your view is.
Okay, no, but we're talking about specifically in the terms of debating antinatalism. Yes, like the Pollyannism is effect as has been noted, is an effect. Most people that don't think about this much will just like answer that off the cuff, like, yeah, it's great. That's not what we're talking about here.
Well, okay, no, hold on. I asked you what's the effect size of the Pollyanna principle. You haven't answered that. You're the one making a positive claim, right? Remember, even if you could argue me all the way down to agnosticism, it still wouldn't show that your side of the motion is correct because you're arguing for a positive claim, which is that it is morally wrong to reproduce. So you have to have the evidence, and you haven't provided it, that the effect size of the Pollyanna principle is strong enough that it outweighs the magnitude of the effect of how happy people are.
No, and because of the axiological asymmetry that we've been discussing most of this time, that doesn't actually hold water either way. So
right, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. This whole, like the quality of life thing, like it's important to establish somewhat, but the main thing that you need to debate about is the axiological asymmetry. And then if they don't accept that, then obviously just go on to the other things like the risk argument, consent argument.
It's not a central point of the argument, so you don't need
the same asymmetry that you already said implies that at the cost of a single pinprick, you could not permissibly bring a person into existence who would live thousands of beautiful, blissful years of happiness and meaning and purpose and pleasure.
Are you talking about when you try to compare it versus like the tortured life?
I'm talking about the pinprick objection, which was separate from the.
Oh, sure, yes, and that is the
yeah.
most
Yep.
that's the hardest pill to swallow of it. Like that strikes people as wrong when you hear it off the top of the head. But it's just, if you accept the proposition that it is the case that for a non-existing being, it's not regrettable that they're not experiencing positive, pleasurable things because there is no being there to be deprived of those pleasures. Like, unless you are like, are you actually right now regretting like the lack of beings on Mars, like any empty spot on Earth or Mars or any like random corner of the universe? Are you sitting here regretting the fact that they are not filled with pleasurable beings? Do you think some moral wrong is being done in the universe by there not being just lots of civilizations of beings experience happy, pleasurable things in all these empty corners of the universe?
Yeah, okay, so the support for Benatar's asymmetry is supposed to be that there are these other asymmetries in ethics that you would expect if it was true. And so one of those is the asymmetry of distant suffering and absent happy people, right? Yeah, okay, so I would just say, look, like welcoming the absence of pain on Mars for the sake of non-existent Martians seems just as absurd to me as regretting the absence of pleasure on Mars for the sake of non-existent Martians. Okay.
Yeah, hold on. Is that really true? Like, do you really think, are you absolutely neutral to the idea of a bunch of beings being tortured on Mars right now? Like, do you think it's totally neutral that's not happening, or do you think it's a good thing that's not happening?
Well, you can, I mean, so you can try to make your view less counterintuitive by claiming that we should welcome the fact that there isn't suffering on Mars. But the reason to have this attitude derives from impersonal considerations rather than individual affecting considerations. But then I fail to see why I can't make parallel claims about the absence of pleasure on Mars.
Do you think that regretting...
I think it's probably better when you're talking about the asymmetry, it's better to talk about the example of a couple going to the clinic and like, or two couples, and one of the couples, you know, they can have a kid that, you know, because of some genetic mutation is guaranteed to have a good life. And the other couple, because of some genetic mutation, the kid they would have, you know, just an just an awful life. And you know, the difference in how we would judge that, like, it would be yeah, it's good that those parents don't act and have the kid that would have the shit life, but that couple who, you know, don't have the kid that would have the amazing life, well, it's neither here nor there. Like, the only reason the kid would benefit from an amazing life is if they existed in the first place to want it or need it.
Do you think that there is an imbalance, like an asymmetry between pleasure and pain? Like, do you agree that suffering is worse than pleasure is good?
Yeah, I'm happy to say that, but I don't think, but remember, your view is more extreme than just that. You're saying that no matter how much pleasure there was in a life, it wouldn't count in favor of creating it.
So, okay, let me word it like this. So, say a god comes up to you, Percy, and says, Percy, I'm in a conundrum. I'm trying to make a decision here. I'm thinking about creating this universe that is just populated to the brim with beings experiencing the maximal possible suffering, just being tortured all the time. And then, but if I do that, I'm also going to create this other universe that's just filled with beings experiencing the maximal possible pleasure, just having awesome, incredible lives. I just don't know what to do. Percy, should I create these two universes? And if you say no, it's either both or neither. What do you think I should do?
Yeah, so I agree. Don't create those, because I agree with you that there is a at least some asymmetry in favor of not creating suffering beings.
Okay, hold on.
My problem is I could just as easily put to you, hey, all you have to do is not eat one particular apple next Thursday, and then an entire universe filled with trillions and trillions of blissfully happy creatures will come into existence. And on your view, you have no reason to not just eat the apple.
Okay, hold on.
Kind of
you just said that
bizarre.
There's some asymmetry. So
yeah.
So the god says, oh man, okay, so you want me to do this, fine. So I really want to create this hell universe. Percy, how many universes do I need to create before you're okay with me creating this one hell universe? How many heaven universes do I need to create to make that okay?
I would say it might be a lot. I don't have a specific number in mind.
I don't think there's any
I don't have a specific number in mind.
No, I don't think there is a number. I think any number that you say is immoral.
Yeah, well, we just have different intuitions about the case example, but I also have a strong, I mean, like when I gave you that example of imagine I could create a universe populated with trillions of people with incredibly happy lives, all of whom will experience one pinprick in their lives. You believe it's outright immoral to create that universe, don't you?
Well, outright it would be barely immoral because it is still a small wrong that you were committing.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it's just a pinprick. Like, fucking get over yourself, son. Do you get what I mean? Like, yeah, it's a harm, but it's a tiny harm. It's like if someone flicked my ear. It's like, yeah, it'd have been better if they'd not done it, but they did it, and it's like, it's a tiny harm. Do you get what I mean?
It is barely immoral to do so, to create a being.
But that's not what we're talking about. And this is where we get with all these like thought experiments and stuff. It's like it distracts from the actual reality of like brutal cancer ravaging people's bodies, like dementia, people losing their minds, you know, cluster headaches, all this sort of stuff.
As a pinprick, but everything else is awesome. But the more important thrust of that is that it's not immoral to not do that. Like there is no, if these beings don't exist, then there is no being to be deprived of those pleasures that you're talking about creating. It's okay to, like, if we just say, hey, should we do this? Should we not? Like, yeah, it would be good if we did, if they had no pain. But it's neutral if we don't do it, if they have no pain. And if they do have pain, it's at least a little negative to do it. It's at least, it is a harm to do something that creates harm. It's the same thing. Like, I don't think you ever actually answered this. Like, did you agree that it is okay to break someone's arm to save them from burning alive in the fire, but it is not okay to harm somebody in order to just bestow a benefit on them? Is it okay to break someone's arm in order to give them $100,000 without them knowing it?
Well, I mean, like childhood vaccination is an example where you risk harming somebody for the sake of creating enormous benefits, right? So a child feels pain.
Yeah, but that's benefits to somebody who already exists. Oh my lord.
In the moment, and in some small percentage of cases, they then go on to suffer horribly. But then we still think it's permissible to do that.
That appeals to a unique duty that a parent has over their wards. Do you think it's okay to do that to someone who's not your child?
All right. How about this example?
See, I think Blake's gone down the wrong sort of angle on this. Like, you could have just said, yeah, that is bestowing a benefit or avoiding a greater harm for someone who already exists.
Okay, so a person, so let's say my roommate, it usually likes to wake up at 7 a.m. And it would really annoy him to be woken up at 5 a.m. That's presumable. But I discovered that there is this life-changing scholarship available that he could do if he's woken up, and it is a time-sensitive thing. So he needs to take action on it within the next hour. So this is.
There was someone who wrote a article refuting antinatalism using an example like that, and I did a reaction to it like ages ago. Like, I think it was one of my first videos, like in the first 10 or 20 videos or something. This guy must have read that article.
Case where I think most people would say if it truly is this incredible scholarship that he would be very happy to have in expectation, but there's still this chance that he'll be really pissed off and not think it was worth it. We would say it's still permissible to wake him up, inducing this potential risk of a harm for the sake of bestowing a pure benefit.
Yes, because our friend Joe here would be deprived of those benefits if you did not do that for him. But we're talking about non-existing beings. There is no being that exists that would be deprived of this
isn't preventing. Benefit. It's not well, I'm not sure what you mean by deprived, because it's not like he was entitled to the scholarship, and it's not like it's not as if he was going. Well, no, hold on. He wasn't going to get the scholarship, but for the fact that it's not that he was going to get the scholarship, because he wasn't. I'm the one who's deciding to offer it to him. If I don't do anything, then he won't even know it's there. So this is bestowing a pure benefit. This isn't me preventing a harm. So it just is a counterexample to your claim that you can't bestow pure benefits.
Well, yeah, but it's failing to serve someone's desire when you have a readily available means of doing that, right? Whereas when you create someone, you're not serving their desire, you're not helping them fulfill some, long-term goal or something. You're literally creating the desire.
Bypass consent.
Do you think you have a moral duty to offer this to your friend Joe, or do you think you're doing something wrong by if you heard about this opportunity and you're like, I just got to tell Joe about it? Do you think like you've done something wrong by not telling Joe about it?
Yeah, so I don't have to claim that you have an obligation to provide it. I just because again, I'm not the one who's the antinatalist who's saying something's wrong here. All I'm saying is that it's not wrong if I do. It's not morally wrong.
It does matter here, because if you do think you have a moral duty to do this, then Joe is being deprived if you choose not to do it. If he's your friend and you think it would be the right thing to do to tell him about this, that would cost you nothing. If you think that's like the morally correct thing to do and you choose not to do it, then it does make sense to say that your friend Joe is being deprived of this opportunity that you callously decided not to tell him about.
Well, okay, deprivation sounds like an entitlement. It implies an entitlement, and the person's not entitled to it.
Okay, so if you don't think
you can't be deprived of something you're not entitled to.
If you don't think that you've done anything wrong by not telling Joe about this, then I think the point you were trying to make earlier falls apart. Then yeah, it's not wrong to not bring someone into existence. Then it still follows that it's not wrong to bring someone into existence for some good if you have to cause them some harm.
Okay. I guess, what do you think? So I've shown you there are two basic options available to the person who doesn't agree with the argument from consent. One is to do what I've been doing, which is you just enumerate counterexamples. Another is to appeal to hypothetical consent. I'm curious what you think about hypothetical consent. I don't think my position requires it, but I do think it is. It's one of two strategies I can take, and even if you showed one failed, then the other would be still available. You'd have to knock down both in order for the argument for consent to go through. So let me just explain what hypothetical consent is. Basically, there's this principle in ethics that if you know for a fact, or if you have a very high expectation that someone would consent to a state of affairs if asked, but they're unavailable to be asked, then it's permissible to bypass that person's consent and provide it to them. Okay, and so one example that's often given is imagine there's a man who's sleeping underneath a giant boulder that will come down and crush them. and they're not available to be asked because they're sleeping. And the only way to pull them out is to intimately touch their thigh, their inner thigh, to pull them out, okay, in time to save them. The question is, why do you think that's permissible, despite the fact that there is a small chance that that person won't live a life worth living, that that person will not actually be okay with being rescued? Well, it's presumably because of this hypothetical consent principle. So where do you stand on the hypothetical consent principle?
I think it basically...
Well, it makes sense when people have pre-established desires, but it doesn't make sense when you're creating someone.
It goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that I don't think that you do have the right to help to harm someone just to bestow a benefit. So remember, in hypothetical consent context, what we're talking about is where there's an enormously high probability that the person would be okay with you bestowing the benefit, even without having asked them, because they're not available to be asked. So that's the example. So do you think even in that context, it's wrong? The example you gave was still one where you were preventing a harm, though.
That's true. Okay, but let's change it. We'll do a bestow a pure benefit example. Okay, so let's say you had the break someone's arm in order to provide cash to them. I think that's the example you gave.
Yeah, I break someone's arm to give them $100,000.
Right. Okay. So this is how hypothetical consent would be applied to that. So let's say you knew that the person would be okay with you not explicitly asking for consent. You knew that they wanted you to break their arm in order to provide them that cash. Then is it permissible to break their arm to provide the cash to them?
If you knew that they would be cool with it, then yeah, sure.
Or let's suppose you only know with very, very high probability that they'll be okay with it.
Yes, I guess you could say that would be permissible. But importantly here, it is still only because we are talking about an existing being whose life would be improved if we did it, and their life would otherwise be much worse if we didn't do it, for having been deprived of that good that we were considering bestowing upon them.
All right. Well, let me just suggest to the audience that, if not to you as well, that you could invoke a similar basic moral principle in order to explain why it's okay to bring the non-existent into existence. Why is it okay to create people without having gotten their consent in the first place? Well, it's because even though you can't ask anyone who doesn't exist whether they'd be okay with it, in expectation, most people who are alive, the overwhelming majority, are happy with the fact that they exist and would be okay with being brought into existence, even if they weren't available to be asked before it happened. And so you have hypothetical consent to bring people into existence.
I've actually made a video about this before, and I can't remember exactly what it's called. It's called something like, let me find it, I've nearly got it. It's called, hang on, I've gone past it. It is called... No, I've missed it. Where the fuck is it? It's called something along the lines of why most people are glad they are born isn't a reason to create a new person. I found it. It's called Most People Enjoy Life is Not a Reason to Have Kids. I'll get the link. Sorry, I just coughed into the mic. Probably wasn't nice. I'll put the link in the chat in case anyone wants to check that out. Okay, cool.
Again, if you don't, you're talking about existing versus non-existing people. For non-existing people, if we don't bring them into existence, no matter what amount of good you're talking about, there is no one in this equation to be deprived of that good. For all the situations that you could possibly give that you're talking about with existing people, it is different because you're talking about someone that could be otherwise deprived by not doing this thing for them. So that's where the breakdown lies. When you're talking about a non-existing person, they cannot be so deprived because there's no one there to be deprived of those goods that you're talking about potentially bestowing.
Okay, now I think you've potentially put yourself into a bind, because now you seem to be saying that hypothetical consent's not applicable because the person doesn't yet exist before they exist to be asked, to be solicited for their consent. But then I think if that's how you feel, you should withdraw your claim that people's consent rights are violated by being created. Because when did that consent violation happen? They weren't. If you think people can't consent before they're brought into existence, then it didn't happen then because they didn't exist. But also,
yeah, the consent violation happens at the point of creation. I don't understand why people find that hard to understand.
The person's created that.
Creating someone requires you to violate consent, to impose harm on someone without being able to gain consent.
Is something that happens it's simply separated by a thunderclap. They weren't there and now they exist. And so there was no point where the person could have been entertained for their consent. So so where is the consent violation?
That wasn't my point.
But the fact that they can't be asked for their consent doesn't mean that there is no violation of consent. It's like saying if someone is if someone is asleep at a party, passed out, and you can't get consent from them, you can fondle them because, how was I supposed to get consent?
The point was that all the goods that you're talking about bestowing don't matter, because when we're talking about a non-existing being, there's no one there to be deprived of those goods. It was not about whether or not we can think about the hypothetical consent of these non-existing beings. It's the fact that regardless of what you think about that question, we should not, it doesn't matter whether we bestow goods through non-existing beings because they don't exist. But it is a case of fact that most people agree that it is a good thing that there are not people being tortured on Mars. So it's not about the hypothetical consent. It's still just about the imbalance there. It doesn't matter whether you can imagine this hypothetical consent or not. It's just true that we should not be harming people, bringing people into existence to be harmed against their consent. In the same way that we could harm someone to save someone from a harm, like breaking their leg to save them from a burning car.
Okay, this sounds completely incoherent to me. I mean, like you're saying my consent rights were violated by the fact that my parents created me. Okay.
No, I'm saying that they did a harm to you by bringing you into existence.
Okay, but you're saying they should have gotten my consent first. But how could they have gotten my consent first?
They couldn't have.
How can I raise? Okay, so then why are you raising the complaint that people weren't given the opportunity to consent before they were created?
Oh, Percy, what are you on? Oh my God. He seems to think that if you can't, if there's no availability to get consent before taking an action, then that just gives you authority to take that action. No, it doesn't. Why would it? If you're in a situation where you can get consent, obviously try get it. If you're in a situation where you can't get consent and you're going to be imposing harm on someone, don't take the action. Unless, obviously, staving off more harm or etc. etc. You get what I mean. But none of those things apply to creating someone.
Why even make that point? I'm so confused.
I don't understand your confusion here.
I thought you were saying that it's an injustice to bring people into the world without their consent. But now you're saying people can't supply their consent, hypothetically or actually. So why say it's an injustice if in order for something to be an injustice, it has to actually be possible for you to have done differently, right?
It is okay. So it is possible for you to have done differently. I think we're getting hung up here on.
Yeah, you can have done differently, not create them. Oh my Lord.
The consent thing. The larger problem is that or the hypothetical consent thing. The larger problem is that you are doing harm, and by creating this being, and by not creating this being, you are not withholding any good because there's no being to withhold the good from. So my point here is that all of the hypothetical situations that you are giving and can come up with about is it equivalent to this are not actually equivalent. I'm not making a point about the hypothetical consent per se itself. I'm making a point about all of your instantiations of it not being analogous to the situation of a non-existence.
Well, we're gonna go to closing statements at 9 o'clock, 6 minutes, just so you know.
I'm happy to just do that now because I don't really have anything else to bring up in the cross-examination unless Blake wants to.
Yeah, no, I'm good.
Okay, cool. Okay. Then let's start with Blake here. You can give your closing statement. If you want a second, I'll do a little reminder for the Q&A so we can get ready for it.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so a reminder, guys, if you haven't sent in a question or a comment and you'd like to, please feel free to do so. The best way to do it to make sure that I actually read it is to DM me, unless you're a super supporter, in which case you can ping me in the super supporter channel. Also, super supporters do have the perk of getting to come on stage and ask their question if they'd like to. So you have that option as well. So again, super supporters should ping, and everyone else, the question or comment should DM. There's no guarantee that I will see where it is or remember it if you put it anywhere else. All right, Blake, closing statement. They'll give you about 4 minutes here on the clock, and you can start.
All right. The main point I want to reiterate here is that the axiological asymmetry does seem to hold, and its implications do seem intuitive to most people that think about it. It just does seem to be the case that nobody regrets or thinks there is some large injustice about any random corner of the universe not having happy people in it. Failing to bring as many happy people into being as you possibly can does not seem like a moral injustice. On the other hand, it is absolutely obvious to most people that think about it that it is a good thing to refrain from harm. It is a good thing that even non-existing beings, in a sense, are not experiencing harm. Is it good that there are not a bunch of people in Alaska right now just being tortured mercilessly? The answer to almost anyone is definitely yes. And the other most important principle is that we should avoid harm whenever possible, especially when we're talking about beings that stand to gain in no way from doing the thing that would cause them harm. So when we bring a being into existence, we undoubtedly cause it harm. That's unavoidable. No one lives a perfect life. you have done a harm by bringing this person into existence. But by refraining from bringing this person into existence, you have not deprived anyone of a good, of the goods that do come with life, because there exists no being there to be deprived of those goods. Thank you.
All right, Percy.
Okay. Earlier on in this debate, my opponent advanced the quality of life and the risk arguments for antinatalism. These arguments say that you have a moral obligation not to create people because in expectation, those people will live lives not worth living. I countered my opponent by saying that actually there is a wealth of empirical literature documenting
Not worth starting, which is different from not worth continuing. But Percy has made so many mistakes this debate.
the fact that the overwhelming majority of people report living net positive lives. My opponent countered by saying that this evidence is not actually probative because of the Pollyanna principle. I asked him, in order for that to be true, the effect size of that particular observation would have to be greater than the effect size of people's happiness as seen in surveys, and he didn't provide me with a figure after several repeated requests, which I think means he probably doesn't have it at his disposal. The reason I emphasize that is as an actual deficit of my opponent's presentation is because he's the one making a positive claim. Remember, he's the one saying that we have a moral obligation not to reproduce, even if he could argue my position, even if my position only has the effect on you, dear audience, of making you agnostic on the motion, well, then you still have to disagree with my opponent. Okay, so he has a very high burden of justification. He has not met it in terms of the empirical requirements. Okay. I raised the point about convergent validity of many different measures of happiness, including the fact that the same people who say that they are happy are also people who, by the witness of the other parties in their lives, their teachers, their friends, and their family, smile more often, laugh more often, and have the same buoyant demeanor that you would expect if they were happy, and have the appropriate expected neurological activity in the areas of the brain in neuroimaging studies that you would expect if that person was experiencing positive emotion. I was able to extract from my opponent an almost complete concession to the argument that his position implies that it would be permissible to pursue a campaign of mass coercive sterilization, specifically of highly fertile populations like Orthodox Jews. You'll remember my argument for that claim was simply that people don't have a right to things that...
He did, unless I'm completely misremembering, he did not agree to that. I think the only thing he said there may be a case for is in isolation, they don't have a moral right to it. But I'm not sure he said legal right, and I'm not sure he said legal right in the real world. So again, I don't know what Percy's on. I don't know if he took something before this debate and it just muddled his mind.
They could only use or will foreseeably use to violate other people's rights or to commit grave injustices. And my opponent said that is true and that applies to our reproductive functions. And so then I asked him, given the law of exponential growth and the fact that when one person reproduces several times, they set in motion a chain of reproductions that will number into the thousands within a few generations, I asked him, would it be permissible to prevent this horrific chain of injustices by taking from the first member of that chain something they don't even have a right to in the first place, which is their reproductive functions? And he said, yes, it seemed to.
That's also not how reproduction works in the real world, because obviously, like, there's like reproducing to the replacement level, but then also like not all of your kids are going to reproduce. Not all of them are going to reproduce to the to the extent he's positing. If they were, then the human population would just explode. But it's only projected to reach, I believe it's 11 billion, or is it 14 billion, and then it will cap out, and then start declining after that point. But yeah, the way he's talking about it, you know, there are going to be like trillions and trillions of humans.
And so we should. So his conclusion implies that we should sterilize Orthodox Jews involuntarily. My opponent also advanced the axiological asymmetry in favor of antinatalism.
Plus, I also think he's using like Orthodox Jews because obviously Jewish people have been repressed throughout history. So I think he's trying to like lean on that emotional sort of heartstring.
Logical asymmetry claims that the pleasure of a potential life.
But, you know, like, whatever, you know, I guess someone could say that about antinatalists too when they talk about, you know, people with cancer or children in hospitals and stuff. So
not count in favor of creating it. Only the pain counts against creating it. I asked my opponent, does this imply that if a person could live thousands of years of bliss and meaning and purpose and fulfillment at the cost of a single pinprick, would it be morally wrong to create that being? And my opponent simply bit the bullet. He just said yes. Okay.
Well, no, he didn't simply just say yes. He said it would be a harm to create them, but it would be it would be a very small harm. And even the quote that Percy read out by David Benatar, he said this would be easily outweighed by the interests of the people who would be creating that person. So, like,
It also seems, by virtue of what I said about sterilizing Orthodox Jews, to also be committed to an anti-pro-choice perspective on abortion, because gestating to term is also enacting a rights violation upon the fetus, and it's putting to use your reproductive functions, which he agreed earlier in the debate you do not have a right to have. Okay.
moral right.
My opponent seems to think that you do have a duty to. How many seconds? 20 seconds?
20 seconds.
Okay. I'll just stop with saying, let me just emphasize how implausible the axiological asymmetry really is. What this implies is that you should not bring, that is to say, you have a moral obligation not to create utopia if everyone will experience even the slightest pinch on their arm. That is a non-starter.
I swear. You know, like, listening to Percy in this debate is one of the many harms of coming into existence. Like, like, that is not what antinatalism is saying. Like, antinatalists understand that people are going to be brought into existence. So, I mean, first of all, utopia isn't a real thing. It's not going to happen, Percy, you're dreaming. But let's say it could be achieved. Obviously, antinatalists are going to say, yeah, since people are going to come into existence, we should pursue that utopia. But we should also try and reduce the number of people coming into existence. And if we have to prioritize utopia or just voluntarily, you know, ceasing to exist as a species and through non-reproduction, we should take non-reproduction. But that doesn't mean utopia is off of the table. If we know beings are going to constantly be brought into existence, which there always will be, then we can aim for utopia as well.
For any plausible ethical theory. If you believe that, then it is impossible to believe that any of the other claims that you make are going to be well evidenced, especially if they're ethical, particularly if they're ethical claims, is what I mean. So that a principle like that, even if it had explanatory benefits for some of the asymmetries that my opponent said it did, you should still rule it out just because of how overwhelmingly implausible its implications are. Okay. Yeah.
All right. That'll conclude our debate. Very nice job from both sides. We will get into a Q&A here. Once again, if you haven't sent any question or comment, you can do so in the Super Supporters channel, or you can DM me. I will start with our Super Supporters. Thank you for supporting us. The first one, and a reminder as always, if you don't want your name read, please let me know. Just add anonymous there, and then we'll know it comes from Anonymous Johnson for all of those questions or comments. All right, first one is from Trader. Question for Blate. On the axiological asymmetry argument, could you explain why an empty Mars absent of suffering is good in itself rather than neutral? Who exactly is it good for? There are no agents there to enjoy this lack of suffering. You identify this issue on the lack of pleasure side, but it seems it should apply equally to the lack of pain.
Yeah, that's kind of the crux of the asymmetry. If you just disagree with that, like axiomatically, that's fine. But that's why it basically multiple other asymmetries are pointed to show that this just does seem to be the case that it's an axiological asymmetry. It's an asymmetry of value, and what we do, it seems that we do value the fact that there is not suffering happening on Mars. Like most people think, yeah, it's pretty good that there's not people being tortured in the house next to me. Like that's not just neutral. No one's just like generally indifferent to that. We agree that it's good that that's not the case. Whereas if you ask people like, hey, is it like a terrible injustice that like not every square inch of the universe is like filled with like happy person?
Yeah, and they're not saying it's actively good as in there's actively someone benefiting from that. They're just saying, in my judgment, it's a good thing that someone is not being tortured in that room.
Here, and here, and can we fit one more in between these two people that are here? They're both pretty happy. It just doesn't hold the same weight at all. So that just does seem to be the case.
All right. Next super supporter question is from Jeb, also for Blate. If you had an opportunity to murder an Orthodox Jew that wants to be a parent, should you do it? The additions are like murder in their sleep, no friends and family. You know you'll get away with it, etc.
No, because the principle of autonomy. I don't think I'm going to the principle of autonomy, and also just epistemic humility. Like there's also the chance that I'm not right on my views here, and I don't want to prematurely impose world-changing principles of murder and mayhem until like we've really all come to an agreement on this principle.
Is that like a meta epistemic humility as for your moral system?
Yeah.
I understand. Okay, interesting. I don't hear that one very often. Next super supporter question is from Powers for Percy. Question is, are those headphones any good?
Oh yeah, they're great. Love them.
This one's for Percy, sorry, although it's probably good.
Oh.
They're okay, but the microphone is really bad, and I'm a little worried that, now that you mention it, is my audio really bad right now?
No, you sound good.
No, it's fine.
Okay.
Do you have the Sony? Are those the Sonys, Percy? If so, I can also vouch.
They're Bose, B-O-S-E.
Okay, gotcha. All right, next question is from Anti to Blate. Percy presented a case where an individual loses all consciousness and brain function. For all intents and purposes, we are going to refer to them as dead. Percy's question was whether or not you would find it objectionable to, and if you would have a moral duty not to, bring a dead person back to life. The person that is bringing the deceased back to life is making an independent calculus on the deceased person's behalf, i.e. choosing to resurrect their dead child. Would you allow us to resurrect the dead loved one? If so, then how does this not meet the same criteria as your slavery example? How do you square this? If not, then we are not only talking about potential lives that could have existed and were not realized, we are now also talking about individuals that have existed and that can be continued. How do you square all of this?
Yeah, because I do not think that a non-existing being and a being who has existed and does not currently at present exist but may continue to exist in the future are like ontologically equivalent. They just require different considerations. When you're talking about a non-existent being, there is no referent there. There is no being there that we can rationally say is being deprived of any goods that he or she, well, that doesn't even make sense for them, may experience in the future. But if we're talking about an existing being that for whatever reason has just like temporarily ceased existing but may continue existing in the future, there is a referent there. There is an entity, a person that we can reference and talk about whether or not it would be good or bad for them. So it's a weird case that doesn't actually analogize well to the issue of antinatalism.
Okay. I'm sorry, I forgot one other super supporter question. This is from Anonymous. It is for Percy. Super supporter wants to know, what is Percy's general thought on the DN thought experiment related to antinatalism?
The DN thought experiment?
Yep. The D's nuts thought experiment.
Oh my God.
Wow.
Make something a little more substantial, please.
Incredible. Hey, a super supporter sent it in. I have to read it. Okay. So, all right. Back to the non-super supporters, aka the plebs. Another pleb, Whale. He would like to ask Blake the following. If it's immoral for a married couple to bring a child into the world with the knowledge of that child being able to cure... Wait, sorry, let me restart this from the top. Can you ask Blake if it's immoral for a married couple to bring a child into the world with the knowledge of that child being able to cure cancer? Parentheses, the couple also really wanted to have a child. You can answer that first part, and then there's a kind of follow-up to it. So we'll start with that.
So we know that bringing the child into existence will cause harm. So like to make it more extreme, it's kind of like asking the same thing as like, is it okay to torture this child if we can get the cure for cancer out of him? I mean, I don't know. You can weigh up the harms and benefits if you want. You can decide whether or not you're making more existing people's lives better by torturing this child or by doing just the harm of bringing them into existence. Otherwise, but yeah, like I think like the greater point is you are undoubtedly doing a harm by bringing this child into existence, regardless of what other benefits to all the already existing beings may result from that.
Okay, so the follow-up was if it's, well, okay, but you said it's immoral, correct?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, this follow-up I don't think applies then, but Whale, let me know if you had a different follow-up based on him saying it's immoral. You can DM me again.
You might still choose to do it. You might decide like, fuck it, it's worth it to like make all these people's lives better after we cure the cancer, but I still think you're harming that child for sure.
Okay. Let's see. Next one is from Fire Owl. How is someone given the choice of foregoing life? Does that choice come easily? Could one kill someone else post-birth with no remorse? If so, how can one make that choice over someone else morally without it being murder? I assume this is for Blade.
I didn't follow that.
How is someone given the choice? Yeah, how is someone given the choice of foregoing life? Does that choice come easily? Could one kill someone else post-birth with no remorse? If so, how can one make that choice over someone else morally without it being murder?
If I understood correctly, it sounds like he kind of shifted in the middle from talking about a non-existent being at first to an existing being afterwards, and in which case, like talking about murdering a being that's already been born. Yeah, I agree that's wrong because we should respect their autonomy and let them kill themselves if they want to.
Next question is from Bottle, again for Blade, regarding your distinction of a life worth starting versus a life worth continuing. This might be a mouthful. Consider the following hypothetical. Consider two lives, A and B. A is born. B lives already a day, and from that day on lives the exact same life as A will after birth. Question is, do both lives deserve the same moral consideration? A prior to birth, B within its first day of life. More specifically, is there a difference between preventing A from being born and killing B? If yes, why do you make the distinction? If no, how do you explain that they deserve different moral consideration, given that they have/will have the exact same life?
The distinction is that for being A, there is actually no reference there, even though we are pretending that there is by calling it being A. There is nobody that we're talking about there to be deprived of the goods of the lives we're talking about. We're just choosing whether or not to harm, like just to bring a new being into existence that will be harmed in exchange for any amount of goods that we think may come along with it. And as with the case of like pulling somebody from a burning car versus breaking their leg for 100K against their will, the same logic applies.
Okay. Next one is from Bardiel for Blade. Blade previously argued that we should cure severely injured people because they can just kill themselves later. Why not extend that to non-existing beings as well? Let people get pregnant because the child can just kill themselves later.
Because you have to create this, you basically have to bring this person into this situation where we think it's likely that they're going to want to kill themselves. We have to, not this person, we have to create a...
Yeah, it's like you're creating someone out of nothing, right? Putting them in a situation where the only way they can get out of it is killing themselves. But when you save someone, like they're going to die anyway, right? Like if someone's in an accident and you take them out of the car and you save their life, like, you're not saving their life, you're just extending their existence, right? So, like, you haven't put someone in a situation where there's a new harm coming to them, if you get what I mean. Or maybe that's not the best way of putting it, but it's like when you create someone, you have created a harm, death, right? Along with all the other harms. In this other example, they're going to die anyway, so that harm is locked in. So you haven't done harm to them in the same way. But it's kind of hard to talk about when you don't have specifics of the scenario. You kind of need to drill into the specifics, I think.
Being in this negative predicament in order to just give them the option of whether or not they want to kill themselves. I just think it's obvious we shouldn't do that. And if you want to say, oh, but they'll be deprived of these goods, again, that's why it's just hard to, people have like struggle imagining the case of the non-existent being versus the existent being. When you're talking about an existing being, which is what we're almost always talking about, it makes sense that we don't want to be deprived of the possible goods that we're talking about because we're beings that might want those goods. When we're talking about a non-existing being, there is no one there to be deprived of those goods. So we know we cannot bring a new being into existence and harm them and give them the option to kill themselves just because there might be some good stuff too.
Okay, next question is from J. Moss, again for Blate. Imagine that there's a drug that causes extreme suffering for a temporary period of time when consumed. Anyone who consumes this drug will have the choice to stop consuming the drug in the future, ending their suffering. However, once one consumes the drug, they will become deluded into thinking that the drug makes them better off, which causes them to constantly seek the drug. Do we have an obligation to give someone the choice to consume this drug? If no, then how is giving someone this drug relevantly different from saving a drowning person? In both cases, the person is made worse off by our action, but they will have the choice to undo our action in the future, even though they will be deluded into thinking our action improved their life.
Yeah, it's just not analogous. Like I said before, you're returning them to the state they were at. You're not making them worse off.
Are they going to die? I didn't hear at the beginning. Are they going to die if we don't give them this drug?
I do not think so, no.
Then
Maybe
no, we don't
Jake
have we don't have the obligation to give them the drug.
Okay. And yeah, he had a follow-up as well. Is it wrong to create a person who will experience one pinprick if it permanently ends all other suffering?
Almost certainly not in that case, but that's because now you've brought existing beings into the math and like the potential alleviation of all of their suffering.
So you're saying it's not wrong to do this?
Yeah, correct. Like technically you're still like doing a small amount of harm, but in this case you do weigh the benefits because the benefits we're talking about are being applied to existing beings, not.
All the questions are for Blake. I think it's because people do find this, well, one, like he's on the affirmative. People find this subject very interesting, but it would be cool if there were more questions for Percy, to be honest.
Existing beings so like a non-existing being could not possibly regret the lack of that good, but we're talking about bestowing good to beings that absolutely could regret the lack of that good.
Okay. Last one I think I see is a follow-up from Anti from before. So if we made all currently living people immortal, you would be comfortable with that? Or if we just purely resurrected currently existing people and never had any future people? Question mark.
If we made all currently living people immortal, would I be okay with that?
Yeah.
Like against their will, like if they want to be immortal, yeah, absolutely, go for it. Make them immortal against their will, yeah, that sounds terrible. That's not, yeah, no, definitely not.
Okay. All right. Any other questions? Throw them in quickly, please, so that I can see them. Oh, Bada would like you to engage with, so this was the A and B hypothetical. Suppose that A is guaranteed to have the exact same life as B, if this changes your answer at all.
I'm trying to remember what A and B were, if I think I remember correctly.
A is not yet born, if I understand, but they're going to have an identical life aside from that difference of one day between the life of B that is already alive.
Yeah, so
and then his question was if they deserve different or similar moral considerations.
It's still basically, this hypothetical is just trying to smuggle in the idea of an existing being by saying like this being A is guaranteed to have this life. You're basically just trying to like make this being ontologically exist in our minds. If it is a non-existent being, then it does not matter because there is no being there to be deprived of the goods that it could have in that life. If you make this being exist by just calling it being A, saying it absolutely will have this life. Now, I don't think that makes it an actually existing being, but if you want to, if it does, then sure. Then now we're just comparing existing being versus existing being. The math changes there.
Okay. Question from Johnny Boy. Percy, what are you snacking on?
Pistachio nuts. I got like
pistachio nuts.
Ridiculous.
And people say life is worth living when we're reduced to eating pistachios. Incredible.
I'm not waiting until I don't. It keeps me from spending my whole day longing for food and suffering the hunger.
It'd be so much better if you did.
It's true. It solves Blade's concern, yes, about that residual hunger.
You could be experiencing so much more pleasure if you just went through that pain for a little bit, Percy.
One more question from Whale. You do not have to answer the question if you want to. But his question is, what are your educational backgrounds to both of you?
bachelor's in psychology.
A bachelor's in philosophy and a bachelor's in psychology.
Oh.
Helped me. I had a minor in philosophy, if that helps.
I have a bachelor's in pistachio science.
Nice.
J Moss has a follow-up on the previous question. So Blake agrees that creating persons is okay so long as it benefits existing persons? Question mark.
No, it's just that it changes the math. Like the whole reason when we're talking about when we're saying it's wrong to bring beings into existence, we're talking about for their own sakes. If you were talking about the benefits that it brings to existing beings, like again, the reason that doesn't matter for non-existing beings is because there is no being there to be deprived of those goods. If you want to start talking about the math of how much it helps existing beings, the math changes there dramatically. But then you have all sorts of other issues, like are you willing to like would you have a child, like if your kid needed a kidney transplant, would you have like needed two kidneys, and would you have two babies? Like, would you give birth to twins just to take their kidneys and give them to your existing baby, like just to improve his life or help him continue living? Would you like doom these other two lives? It's just the math just gets crazy there, and it's not really the central focus of the antinatalism point. The antinatalism argument is about the benefits and harms to the beings themselves, not about to us already existing beings.
All right.
Boom. That is that done. Okay, so that's that debate done. That was a bit of a marathon, but it was interesting. It was cool to see. It was cool to see like a debate happening on antinatalism, like in one of these debate forums, to be honest, because there aren't many of them. I think there have definitely been some, but they're all quite old. I'm trying to think if there have been other more recent ones, but I can't really think of any. But yeah, I enjoyed that. I think, to be honest, I think Blake did like very well. Even the things that I, criticized his, approach on, or the way he framed things sometimes, overall, like, he was on his own, representing a philosophy which is very counter to a lot of people's deeply held beliefs, and and also like personal sort of desires of what they want to do in the future, have a kid. So I think, given that, he held his own, and I commend him for that. So nice one, Blake. It's also interesting. I've never seen Blake anywhere or heard of him. So yeah, for me it was nice to see like a new person coming out and arguing for the philosophy. But anyway, I think this stream has been going on for a while now. Yeah, we're in 2.5 hours. Well, thank you everyone for joining. There will probably be a few more streams coming up in the next few days, actually, because the Raphael Samuel has just had a conversation come out with another, presumably Indian, on an Indian podcast. So I'm going to do a reaction to that. And also, after the conference this weekend, Matty Hyrie and David Pearce have had a discussion/debate on the Exploring Antinatalism podcast, so I'm going to be live reacting to that as well. Those will all be coming in the next few days, so look forward to those. But anyway, thank you everyone for joining this one. I hope you enjoyed the debate and my thoughts on it as and when I gave them. I'm sorry for if my voice is a bit different and that I was like sniffly all the way through. But I am still a bit ill. But yeah, thank you again, and I will see you guys all in the next one.